In the frozen woods of the Ardennes, a battered American infantry unit was about to be wiped out. The relentless shelling of German 88s had reduced their forward camp to craters and broken bodies, leaving the survivors scattered and cut off. What had started as a desperate attempt to regroup turned into a last stand when the Germans closed in, confident in their overwhelming firepower. Lieutenant James "Red" Calloway wasn't just another frontline officer. For 3 brutal campaigns, from North Africa to Italy, he had led men through hell and back, earning a reputation for surviving the impossible. In Sicily, he'd orchestrated an ambush so precise that an entire Panzer column was left in smoldering ruins. But even he had never faced odds like this. When German forces advanced under the cover of artillery, expecting a clean sweep, they had no idea they were walking into a trap. Calloway had one last card to play, a weapon so classified even his own men barely understood it. With nothing left to lose, he made the call that would turn the battlefield into a proving ground for horrors no one had foreseen. What began as a hopeless retreat would become something far worse. The Ardennes would never be the same after the day the war itself changed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first shell landed without warning. James "Red" Calloway felt the ground beneath him convulse before his ears registered the thunderous crash. One moment, he was reviewing map coordinates with Sergeant Martinez. The next, he was face down in frozen mud as the world exploded around him. Incoming! Calloway's voice was swallowed by the second impact, which tore through the trees above them, sending deadly wooden splinters sailing through the air like shrapnel. The German 88s had found them. Calloway spat dirt from his mouth and raised his head just enough to assess the devastation unfolding across their position. The forward camp of the 109th Infantry, his men, scattered like ants from a kicked hill. Through the haze of snow and smoke, he spotted Sergeant Leo Martinez already on his feet, frantically waving soldiers toward the tree line. "Move! Move! Get to the woods!" Martinez shouted, his Brooklyn accent thick with urgency. Another shell whistled overhead, and Calloway's instincts took over. He pushed himself up and sprinted toward a massive fallen oak as the ground erupted behind him. The concussion threw him forward, and he tucked into a role that his body remembered from basic training years ago, before North Africa, before Italy, before he'd watched too many good men die under his command. "Lieutenant, over here!" He followed Martinez's voice to where a cluster of his men had found cover in a shallow ravine beside the dense forest. Calloway slid down the embankment, counting heads as he dropped into position beside his sergeant. "Report," he demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. "We've got 14 accounted for," Martinez answered, his dark eyes scanning the chaos. "Harrison's over there with Johnson and Benson. Peterson took shrapnel to the leg. Kleinman is—" He hesitated. Calloway followed his gaze to where Private Jacob Kleinman, barely 18 and 3 weeks out of basic, stood frozen in the open, his eyes wide with terror as shells continued to rain down around him. "God damn it," Calloway muttered. "Where's Harrison?" As if summoned by his name, Capelier Frank Hawk Harrison appeared beside them, his lean face streaked with dirt and something darker that Calloway chose not to identify. "Lieutenant," Harrison acknowledged, his voice carrying that perpetual edge of barely contained rage. "Germans have our range. We need to move deeper into the forest or we're dead." Another shell landed close enough to shower them with dirt. Harrison didn't flinch. "Kleinman's in shock," Calloway said, nodding toward the paralyzed private. Harrison's eyes narrowed. "I'll get him." Before Calloway could respond, Harrison was gone, sprinting across the exposed ground with a reckless disregard for his own safety that had made him both the best and most dangerous soldier in the company. "He's gonna get himself killed," Martinez muttered. Calloway watched as Harrison reached Kleinman, grabbed him by his collar, and began dragging the younger man toward cover. "Not today," he replied. "Today we need his kind of crazy." The artillery barrage intensified, walking closer to their position with each thunderous impact. Harrison and Kleinman tumbled into the ravine just as a shell obliterated the spot where they'd been standing moments before. "Thanks for joining us, Mouse," Harrison said, roughly shoving Kleinman deeper into cover. The nickname, a reference to the young private's small stature and perpetually nervous demeanor, seemed especially fitting now as Kleinman curled into himself, eyes squeezed shut. I couldn't move," Kleinman stammered. "I just couldn't." "Save it," Harrison cut him off. "You freeze like that again, I'll leave you for the Krauts." "Enough," Calloway intervened. "Martinez, what's our situation with command?" Martinez's expression darkened. "Radio Shack took a direct hit. Reynolds is dead, so is Wilson, and the radio—" He shook his head. "Nothing but twisted metal now." The implications settled over Calloway like a physical weight. Cut off, no reinforcements, no evac, no artillery, support of their own. "What about the supply depot?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. "Gone," Martinez confirmed. "Munitions, medical supplies, rations, all of it." Another shell landed close enough to spray dirt across their faces. Calloway wiped his eyes, his mind racing through their rapidly dwindling options. "Sir," a voice called from further down the ravine. "Sir, Kovalchuk needs help." Calloway turned to see Pert Victor Kovalchuk struggling with a large wooden crate, his wiry frame straining under its weight as he attempted to drag it down the embankment. Two soldiers moved to assist him. "No," Kovalchuk shouted, his Eastern European accent thick with panic. "Be careful, very careful with crate." Calloway exchanged a glance with Martinez. The classified cargo. In the chaos, he'd almost forgotten about their unusual assignment, transport of an experimental weapon to division headquarters. They'd never been told exactly what was in the crate, only that it was of highest priority and potentially war-ending. "Help him secure it," Calloway ordered, "but keep it covered." As soldiers moved to assist Kovalchuk, Calloway turned back to Martinez. "We need to move deeper into the forest before those 88s find our exact position." Martinez nodded grimly. "And then what, Lieutenant? We're at least 10 miles behind enemy lines now. The offensive pushed right past us while we were pinned down here." Calloway had no immediate answer. The reality of their situation was beginning to crystallize. They were trapped, with limited ammunition, no communications, and no clear path to friendly lines. And somewhere out there, the Germans were preparing to finish the job their artillery had started. "One problem at a time, Sergeant," he finally replied. "Get the men moving. 200 yards east, there's a depression that should provide better cover. We'll regroup there." As Martinez relayed the orders, Harrison sidled up to Calloway, his rifle clutched tight against his chest. "We should use it," he said without preamble. Calloway didn't pretend to misunderstand. "The weapon? We don't even know what it is." Harrison's eyes gleamed with something that made Calloway uneasy. "Kovalchuk knows, and whatever it is, it's got him scared shitless." He nodded toward where the engineer was still fussing over the crate, checking and rechecking its fastenings with trembling hands. "That's not ordinary cargo, Lieutenant. That's our ticket out of here, or our chance to make these German bastards pay." The venom in Harrison's voice was familiar. Ever since losing his brother to German artillery in Italy, Harrison had fought with a vengeance that bordered on suicidal. "That's not our mission," Calloway said firmly. "Our orders are to deliver it intact." Harrison's laugh was harsh. "Our mission?" "Look around, Red. Our mission went to hell the moment those shells started falling. Now we're just trying to stay alive." Before Calloway could respond, Martinez returned, his expression grim. "Men are ready to move out," he reported. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "We've got 4 men with injuries. Peterson's the worst. He won't make it far without medical attention." Calloway nodded, making quick calculations. "We'll improvise stretchers if we have to. No one gets left behind." As the men prepared to move out, Calloway conducted a hasty inventory of their remaining supplies. The results were disheartening. Limited ammunition, a few days' worth of rations if strictly rationed, and medical supplies that would be exhausted by nightfall if they treated all the current injuries. The artillery had fallen silent for the moment, which worried Calloway more than the barrage. Silence meant the Germans were changing tactics, perhaps sending in infantry to sweep the area for survivors. As the light began to fade, they established a makeshift camp in the forest depression. The wounded were tended to as best they could with their limited supplies. Kleinman, though physically unharmed, sat apart from the others, his young face a mask of shock. Calloway approached him, crouching down beside the private. "First time under heavy fire is always the worst," he offered. Kleinman's eyes were distant. "I couldn't move, sir. My legs just wouldn't work." He looked up, his face etched with shame. "I could have gotten Harrison killed." "But you didn't," Calloway pointed out. "And next time you'll be better prepared." "If there is a next time," Kleinman murmured. Calloway had no comforting lie to offer. The boy wasn't wrong. As full darkness descended, an eerie silence fell over the forest. The artillery had stopped. Completely. The Germans either believed they'd eliminated the American position or they were preparing for something worse. Calloway gathered his core team, Martinez, Harrison, and Kovalchuk, around a crude map he'd drawn in the dirt. "We're here," he indicated, marking their position. "The German line has advanced beyond us to approximately here. That puts us deep, behind enemy territory with no clear route back to our lines." Martinez studied the map grimly. "We should move at first light. Try to circle back to friendly positions. It's risky, but staying put is suicide." Harrison snorted. 10 miles through, German-held forest carrying wounded men and whatever the hell is in that crate. That's not risky, that's impossible." "Then what do you suggest?" Martinez challenged. Harrison's gaze shifted to Kovalchuk. "I think it's time our engineer friend told us exactly what we're carrying." All eyes turned to Kovalchuk, who seemed to shrink under their scrutiny. The engineer had always been a mystery to the unit, a Soviet scientist recruited by American intelligence for his expertise in some unspecified field. He rarely spoke of his past, and kept largely to himself. "Is not for field use," Kovalchuk said carefully. "Is prototype only, for testing at secure facility." "That's not an answer," Harrison pressed. "What is it?" Kovalchuk's eyes darted to Calloway, seeking permission, or perhaps absolution. "We're cut off, Victor," Calloway said quietly. "If that crate contains something that could help us survive, we need to know." Kovalchuk's shoulders sagged. "Is weapon, yes, but not conventional. Is, how you say, experimental. Uses principles of electromagnetic disruption to disable enemy. Equipment. All electronics within radius gone." Harrison leaned forward, suddenly intensely interested. "Like an artillery killer? It could knock out those 88s? "Theoretically, yes," Kovalchuk admitted, "but is unstable, unpredictable, was never meant for battlefield deployment." Martinez frowned. "If it's so dangerous, why are we hauling it through? A combat zone?" Kovalchuk's laugh was bitter. "Americans, always rushing. Soviet scientists say more tests, but your generals say, send to front now. Is political decision, not scientific one." A heavy silence fell over the group as they absorbed this information. Calloway's mind raced through the implications. A weapon that could disable German artillery and communications would give them a fighting chance, if it worked as described. If it didn't, "We stick to the plan," he decided finally. "At first light we move west, try to reach our lines. The weapon remains sealed unless we have absolutely no other option." Harrison looked like he wanted to argue but held his tongue. Martinez nodded in agreement, though his expression remained troubled. As the meeting broke up, Calloway remained alone, staring at the crude map. The logical part of him knew their chances were slim. Even if they avoided German patrols, the wounded would slow them down, and winter in the Ardennes was an enemy unto itself. Yet surrendering wasn't an option. Not after what he'd seen happen to captured Americans. Not with men like Kleinman under his command, boys who still believed their lieutenant could lead them home. And then there was the weapon, a wild card that could save them or destroy them. From somewhere in the distance came the low rumble of vehicles, German transporters moving under cover of darkness. They were coming to secure the area. The hunt would begin at dawn. Calloway erased the map with a sweep of his hand and stared into the darkness. They had survived the shelling, but the real test was yet to come. And deep in his gut, he knew that before this was over, he would be forced to make impossible choices. Choices that would haunt him long after the guns of this war fell silent, if he survived at all. The first traces of dawn filtered through, the skeletal trees casting long shadows across the frost-crusted forest floor. Lieutenant Calloway hadn't slept. His breath clouded in the bitter cold as he scanned the perimeter of their makeshift camp, listening for any sound that didn't belong to the wounded men behind him. "Lieutenant." Martinez materialized beside him, moving with the quiet efficiency that had kept him alive for 2 years on the front lines. His dark eyes were sunken with exhaustion but alert. "Patrol coming," Martinez whispered. 5 men, moving east to west. Harrison spotted them from the ridge. Calloway's jaw tightened. "How far?" "Half a mile, maybe less. Moving slow. Checking for survivors from yesterday's barrage." It was the confirmation Calloway had been dreading. The Germans were hunting them, methodically sweeping the forest to eliminate any remaining American forces. With their wounded men and the mysterious cargo, outrunning the enemy wasn't an option. "Get Harrison and Kovalchuk," Calloway ordered. "And find me someone who can still handle a rifle." Within minutes, his core team had assembled. Harrison's eyes gleamed with an unsettling eagerness, while Kovalchuk lingered nervously at the edge of the group. To Calloway's surprise, Kleinman had joined them, his young face pale but determined. "Thought you might need an extra gun, sir," the young private offered. Calloway nodded, studying the boy. The shock from yesterday remained evident in his twitchy movements, but there was something else there too, a desperate need to prove himself after freezing under fire. "All right, listen up," Calloway began, keeping his voice low. "We've got a German patrol closing in. 5 men, standard reconnaissance. We can't outrun them with our wounded, and we can't let them report our position." "So we take them out," Harrison said, stating the obvious with unsettling relish. "Quietly," Calloway emphasized. "No rifles unless absolutely necessary. 1 shot will bring every German within miles down on us." Martinez's expression darkened. "You're talking about an ambush, close quarters." "That's exactly what I'm talking about, Sergeant." Calloway met his gaze steadily. "We catch them in the ravine 100 yards west. Hit them fast, hit them silent." For a moment, no one spoke. They all understood what silent meant. Knives, bayonets, garrots, the messiest, most intimate forms of killing. "This isn't right," Martinez finally said, his voice barely audible. "There are rules to warfare, Lieutenant." "Rules?" Harrison's laugh was sharp and cold. "You think those Kraut artillery men were following rules when they shelled our position? When they killed Reynolds and Wilson? When they—" "Enough," Calloway cut him off. "This isn't about right or wrong anymore, LT. It's about survival." He turned to Kleinman. "You don't have to come. You can stay with the wounded." Kleinman shook his head. "No, sir, I want to help." "And the cargo?" Kovalchuk asked anxiously. "I cannot leave it unguarded." Calloway considered this. "Johnson's wounded, but he can still hold a pistol. He'll watch the crate until we return." He surveyed the group. "Any other concerns?" No one spoke. "Good. We move in 5 minutes. Check your equipment. Remember, silence is survival." They dispersed to prepare, leaving Calloway alone with Martinez. The sergeant's disapproval was palpable. "You don't agree with the order," Calloway stated. Martinez's gaze was direct. "It's not about agreeing, Lieutenant. We both know what needs to be done. He hesitated. "I've seen what this kind of fighting does to men. Harrison's already halfway gone. And Kleinman, this could break him." Calloway felt the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical burden. "If you have a better solution, Sergeant, I'm all ears." Martinez had no answer, and they both knew why. There was no better option, no cleaner path forward, just the brutal calculus of survival. "I'll make sure Harrison doesn't go too far," Martinez finally said, "and I'll watch over the kid." Calloway nodded gratefully. "That's all I can ask." They moved like shadows through the forest, each man acutely aware that a snapped twig or dislodged stone could mean death for them all. Calloway led with Harrison close behind, then Kleinman, Martinez, and Kovalchuk bringing up the rear. The ravine where they planned to spring their ambush was a natural bottleneck, steep sides funneling into a narrow passage that the German patrol would almost certainly use to cross. Calloway positioned his men on both sides, using hand signals to direct them to concealed positions behind trees and boulders. Harrison, predictably, chose the most aggressive position, directly above, the path the Germans would take. His knife was already in his hand, its blade meticulously darkened with dirt to prevent any telltale reflection. Martinez took up position beside Kleinman, silently demonstrating how to brace himself against a tree trunk for stability. The young private's hands were trembling, but his eyes were focused, determined. They waited. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The forest was eerily silent, as if the wildlife sensed the impending violence and had fled. Calloway controlled his breathing, fighting against the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded combat. Then finally, sounds. The muffled crunch of boots on snow, German voices low and casual. They were close enough now that Calloway could make out words, complaints about the cold, a joke about French wine, an order to stay alert. 5 men, as reported, standard Wehrmacht infantry, armed with rifles and at least one machine pistol. They moved with the confidence of soldiers who believed they were hunting, not being hunted. Calloway caught Martinez's eye across the ravine and nodded once. The Germans entered the narrowest part of the ravine, their formation loosening slightly as they navigated the uneven terrain. The lead soldier was just passing beneath Harrison's position when Calloway gave the signal, a soft bird call that could have been natural to anyone except his men. Harrison moved first, dropping silently from his perch onto the lead German's back. His knife flashed once, twice, opening the man's throat in a spray of crimson that painted the snow. The German made a wet, gurgling sound, but nothing loud enough to alert his comrades. In the same instant, Calloway surged forward, driving his bayonet into the chest of the second German, who was still turning toward the commotion. The man's eyes widened in shock, his rifle clattering uselessly to the ground as Calloway's momentum carried them both backwards. The remaining 3 Germans reacted with practiced efficiency, but they were already surrounded. Martinez tackled one, driving him into the snow with a hand clamped over his mouth while his other hand worked a knife between the man's ribs. Kovalchuk, despite his academic appearance, moved with surprising speed. He engaged the German carrying the machine pistol, grappling for control of the weapon before it could be fired. That left the 5th German for Kleinman. The young private hesitated for a crucial second as the German brought his rifle to bear. Calloway, still struggling with his own opponent, could only watch in horror as the German's finger tightened on the trigger. But the shot never came. With a strangled cry, Kleinman launched himself forward, his bayonet extended. The blade caught the German in the throat, driving deep with the full weight of Kleinman's momentum behind it. For a moment, the 2 men stood frozen in a grotesque embrace. Then the German collapsed, dragging Kleinman down with him. The private lay atop the dying man, unable or unwilling to pull his bayonet free, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and revulsion. "Clear your sectors," Calloway ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. He scanned the area, confirming that all 5 Germans were down. Harrison was already moving between the bodies, methodically checking for any signs of life, and delivering coup de grace strokes where necessary. His face was spattered with blood, but his expression was coldly clinical. Martinez helped Kleinman to his feet, gently pulling the young man away from the German he'd killed. "First one's the hardest," he murmured, though whether to comfort Kleinman or remind himself, Calloway couldn't tell. Kovalchuk stood over the German whose machine pistol he'd taken, breathing heavily. "Is done," he said simply. For a moment it seemed they had succeeded. A clean ambush, executed without alerting the wider German forces. Calloway allowed himself a brief moment of relief, It was shattered by a single pneumatic hiss. All heads turned to see the fifth, German, the one Kleinman had stabbed, raising a flare gun with his last strength. Before any of them could react, he fired. The signal rocket shot skyward, bursting above the tree canopy in a brilliant crimson star that hung in the morning sky like an accusing eye. Son of a bitch! Harrison lunged forward, driving his knife into the German's chest repeatedly, long after the man had ceased moving. Harrison, enough! Calloway grabbed his arm. He's dead, we need to move. Now. The distant sound of motorized vehicles grew suddenly louder. The Germans had seen the flare and were responding. Back to camp, Calloway ordered. Grab their weapons and ammunition. Leave the bodies. They fled through the forest, abandoning stealth for speed. Kleinman stumbled more than once, his face vacant with shock. Martinez kept a steadying hand on the young private's shoulder, urging him forward. They had barely reached their makeshift camp when the first mortar rounds began falling. The Germans were firing blind, saturating the area where the flare had been spotted. Get the wounded up, Calloway shouted as tree bursts showered the area with deadly wooden splinters. Martinez, secure the crate. Everyone move east toward the stream bed. The camp dissolved into controlled chaos as the able-bodied men helped the wounded to their feet. Peterson, the worst injured, cried out in agony as two men lifted him onto an improvised stretcher. Harrison appeared at Calloway's side, his face still streaked with German blood. They'll have infantry following those mortars, he said. We've got minutes, maybe less. I know, Calloway replied grimly. The flare had eliminated any chance of slipping away unnoticed. Now they were marked prey with the full might of a German infantry battalion bearing down on their position. As they prepared to move out, Calloway caught sight of Kleinman. The young private was staring at his blood-stained hands, rubbing them together as if trying to clean them in the snow. Kleinman, Calloway called. When the private didn't respond, he moved closer. Jacob, look at me. Slowly, Kleinman raised, his eyes. You did what you had to do, Calloway told him. We all did, but it's not over. I need you focused. Can you do that? For a long moment, Kleinman said nothing. Then, with visible effort, he straightened his shoulders. Yes, sir. Good, man. Calloway squeezed his shoulder. Stay close to Martinez. As they moved out, weaving through the trees as mortar fire continued to rain down behind them, Martinez fell into step beside Calloway. This can't go on, the sergeant said quietly. The wounded can't keep up, and that sound carries for miles, in this forest. They'll find us. What are you suggesting? Calloway asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Martinez's gaze drifted to where Kovalchuk and two other men struggled to carry the mysterious crate. We can't keep running. Lieutenant, sooner or later we have to make a stand. You want to use the weapon? Calloway stated flatly. I want to survive, Martinez countered. And right now, that crate is the only advantage we have. It was a stark reversal from the previous night, when Martinez had argued vehemently against using the experimental technology. The ambush had changed him just as it had changed them all. Calloway was spared from responding when a mortar round landed closer than any previous one, sending them all diving for cover. As the smoke cleared, he saw that two of his men had been hit, one dead instantly, the other screaming as he clutched at his shredded leg. Harrison was already beside the wounded man, applying a tourniquet with grim efficiency. He's losing too much blood, he reported. He won't make it far. The reality of their situation crystallized in that moment for Calloway. They couldn't outrun the Germans. They couldn't hide. And with each passing minute, the noose tightened further around their necks. Martinez, he called. Get Kovalchuk, over here. Now. As the engineer hurried over, his face pale with fear and exhaustion, Calloway made the decision he'd been avoiding since they'd first been cut off. Tell me exactly what that weapon does, he demanded. Not the sanitized version, the truth. Kovalchuk's eyes darted nervously between Calloway and Martinez. Is complicated, he began. Simplify it, Calloway snapped. The engineer took a deep breath. Is electromagnetic pulse generator. Creates field that disrupts all electrical systems within radius. Radios, engines, artillery guidance systems. And the range? Martinez asked. 2 kilometers, maybe 3. Depends on terrain. Harrison, who had joined them after stabilizing the wounded man, let out a low whistle. That would knock out their mortars, their vehicles, their comms, everything. For how long? Calloway pressed. Kovalchuk hesitated. Is not temporary. Is permanent damage to circuits, but he trailed off. But what? Side effects not fully understood, the engineer admitted. In tests, strange things happen sometimes. Unexplained phenomena. What kind of phenomena? Martinez demanded. Electrical surges in unexpected places. Compass needles spinning. Animals behaving strangely. Kovalchuk's voice dropped. Some test subjects reported hallucinations. The 3 Americans exchanged uneasy glances as another mortar round landed nearby, closer than the last. We're out of options, Harrison said bluntly. Use it or we all die here. Calloway looked to Martinez, whose expression had hardened into grim resolve. I don't see another way, the sergeant admitted quietly. Calloway closed his eyes briefly, weighing his responsibility to his mission against his duty to his men. When he opened them, his decision was made. Kovalchuk, how quickly can you set it up? The engineer's face was a mask of conflict. 15 minutes, maybe less. But, Lieutenant, you must understand. We don't have time for doubts. Calloway, cut him off. Get it ready. As Kovalchuk hurried back to the crate, Martinez stepped closer to Calloway, lowering his voice. Are you sure about this, Red? We have no idea what this thing might do. Calloway watched as his men struggled forward under fire, carrying their wounded, exhaustion etched into every face. More mortar rounds fell in the distance, but the pattern was changing, becoming more precise, more directed. The Germans were no longer firing blind. They were triangulating. No, he admitted quietly. I'm not sure at all. But we've gone from hunted to hunters and back again, and I won't watch these men die without using every option available. The decision made, Calloway felt an unexpected calm settle over him. Whether they were about to find salvation or doom themselves with unforeseen consequences, at least the uncertainty was over. They would make their stand here, using a weapon none of them fully understood. The hunters had pushed the hunted into a corner, and now they would learn what cornered prey was capable of. The wooden crate lay before them in the small clearing they designated as their fallback position. Mortar fire continued to thunder in the distance, methodically sweeping through the forest behind them. They had minutes, 20 at most, before German infantry would reach their position. Kovalchuk knelt beside the crate, his fingers working the metal latches with practiced precision despite his trembling hands. The rest of the squad formed a loose perimeter around them, the wounded propped against frost-covered trees, weapons ready, but expressions grim. No one harbored illusions about their chances in a conventional firefight. Open it, Calloway ordered, his voice betraying none of the doubt churning in his gut. With a deep breath, Kovalchuk removed the final latch. The lid lifted with a soft creak, revealing a device unlike anything Calloway had ever seen. It resembled an oversized radio transmitter, but with strange cylindrical components and an array of copper coils protruding from its metal housing. At its center sat a glass chamber containing what looked like mercury, glinting with an unnatural blue luminescence. What the hell is that? Harrison asked, moving closer for a better look. Kovalchuk's face was somber. Is prototype of electromagnetic, pulse generator, EMP, Project Lightning. He began removing the device with meticulous care. Was developed in joint project, Soviet and American scientists. Martinez knelt for a closer look, his skepticism evident. And this thing can actually knock out German electronics? All of them? Da! Kovalchuk nodded. In radius of 2, maybe 3 kilometers. All electronic systems will fail immediately. Vehicles, radio equipment, artillery targeting systems. Giving us the window we need to escape, Calloway finished. Or to fight back, Harrison added, eyes gleaming. Kovalchuk continued connecting components with practiced efficiency, though his expression remained troubled. As he worked, he spoke in a low voice, almost as if confessing. I was physics professor in Leningrad before war, specialized in electromagnetic field theory. When Germans invaded, Soviet government put many scientists on weapons projects. His hands moved methodically, attaching wires to a central unit. Americans had similar program. After your president and Stalin became allies, some projects were shared. And this was one of them, Calloway said. Kovalchuk nodded grimly. Most advanced weapon of its kind uses principles never before applied to warfare. He paused, glancing up at Calloway. There is reason it was not deployed earlier, Lieutenant. Because it's untested, Martinez interjected. No, Kovalchuk corrected. Because testing showed concerning results. The engineer's voice lowered to barely above a whisper. Effects go beyond disruption of electronics. In laboratory test, animals exposed to field showed strange behaviors, disorientation, aggression. Some died with no visible cause. A heavy silence fell over the group. Even Harrison's eager expression faltered slightly. You're saying this thing kills animals? Kleinman asked, speaking up for the first time since the ambush. The young private had been unnaturally quiet, his youthful face now etched with the haunted look of someone who had seen and done too much. Not directly, Kovalchuk clarified. His side effect we do not fully understand. Something about how field interacts with neural electricity, perhaps. Human nervous system uses electrical impulses too, yes? Jesus Christ, Martinez muttered. And they want to use this in populated areas? Kovalchuk's laugh was bitter. Why you think they transport through combat zone instead of secure channel is too controversial. If weapon works, generals take credit. If civilians die mysteriously after deployment, blame can fall on frontline officer who misused experimental technology. Calloway felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. He'd seen enough of war to recognize the brutal political calculus Kovalchuk was describing. Frontline soldiers were expendable, convenient scapegoats when military experiments went wrong. How do you know all this? He asked Kovalchuk. The engineer's eyes met his, and Calloway saw something there he hadn't noticed before. Not fear, but guilt. Because I helped design it, Kovalchuk admitted quietly. My equations, my theories on electromagnetic disruption, I thought was for defense only, a shield against German bombs. Then I saw first test. What happened? Calloway pressed. Kovalchuk looked away. Test was in remote area. Small village evacuated for military exercise. Device worked perfectly, all electronic. Equipment disabled instantly. But when soldiers returned to village 3 days later, they found dead animals everywhere. Birds had fallen from sky. And the few civilians who refused evacuation. He shook his head. Official report said heart attacks, natural causes. I knew better. Martinez's expression hardened with disgust. And you were bringing this thing to be mass-produced? To be used near civilian populations? I had no choice, Kovalchuk shot back. You think Soviet scientists can refuse military assignment? My family was already under surveillance for my grandfather's politics. If I refused, he didn't need to finish the sentence. It doesn't matter now, Harrison cut in impatiently. The past is the past. This thing is our only chance. Harrison's right about one thing, Calloway said, his voice level. We need to focus on the present. The Germans are closing in, and we have wounded men who won't survive capture. He turned to Kovalchuk. Can you control the radius? Limit it to just the German forces? The engineer hesitated. Theoretically, yes. Output can be adjusted, but precision is... He made a wobbling gesture with his hand. Without proper calibration, equipment is difficult. So we're talking about an indiscriminate weapon that could have unknown effects on anyone caught in its radius, including us, Martinez summarized grimly. Including any civilians in range, Calloway added, the weight of command feeling heavier with each passing second. Kleinman's young face had gone pale. Sir, If this thing does what he says, it's a weapon, kid, Harrison interrupted brutally. Just like a bullet or a grenade, only bigger. And unlike bullets or grenades, we've got the only one. He turned to Calloway. Lieutenant, while we sit here debating ethics, those German bastards are getting closer. The longer we wait, the more we risk them capturing this thing. As if to punctuate his point, a mortar round landed closer than any previous one, showering them with dirt and pine needles. The Germans were systematically working their way toward their position. Martinez moved closer to Calloway, pitching, his voice low. Red, we can't use this, not without knowing what it might do. There have to be rules in warfare, lines we don't cross. Rules? Harrison scoffed, overhearing. Tell that to the Germans who've been shelling us for the past day. Tell that to the men we've already lost. And what about the men we might kill with this thing? Martinez countered. Not just Germans, but our own troops if they're in range. Civilians. There are no civilians in this hellhole, Harrison snapped. And our men are already dead if we don't do something drastic. The argument was interrupted by Johnson, one of the wounded men, calling from the perimeter. Lieutenant, movement. In the trees 300 yards west. Calloway grabbed his binoculars and scanned the tree line. What he saw made his blood run cold. German infantry, at least a platoon strength, moving in coordinated formation through the forest. And behind them, the unmistakable silhouette of an officer directing their advance. We're out of time, he announced. Kovalchuk, how close are you to having that thing operational? The engineer wiped sweat from his brow despite the freezing temperature. 5 minutes, maybe less. But Lieutenant, you must understand, once activated, there is no containing the effects, no undoing what it does. Martinez grabbed Calloway's arm. Red, think about what you're doing. This isn't just about our survival. It's about what kind of war we're fighting, what kind of men we are. Calloway looked around at the faces of his men, the wounded slumped against trees, Kleinman's shell-shocked expression, Harrison's barely contained fury, Martinez's moral outrage, and Kovalchuk's haunted guilt. Whatever decision he made in this moment would define not just their fate, but who they were as soldiers and as men. Harrison, he called, take 4 men and set up a defensive position to buy us time. Nothing fancy, just enough to slow them down. As Harrison moved to comply, Calloway turned back to Kovalchuk. Continue preparations, but don't activate anything until I give the order. And if they overrun us before then? The engineer asked. Then your final job is to destroy that thing, Calloway replied grimly. Whatever it does, we can't let it fall into German hands. Kovalchuk nodded solemnly and returned to his work, leaving Calloway alone with Martinez. I know what you're thinking, LT, Calloway said quietly. That I'm making a deal with the devil. Aren't you? Martinez challenged. We took an oath to defend our country, not to use weapons that might have consequences we can't even predict. We also took an oath to bring our men home, Calloway countered. Look around you. Without that device, none of us are making it out of these woods alive. Martinez's expression was pained. There are worse things than dying, Red. Like living with what this thing might do. Before Calloway could respond, the distant chatter of small arms fire erupted from the western perimeter. Harrison's defensive line had engaged the approaching Germans. Lieutenant, Harrison's voice called over the gunfire. Multiple squads approaching. We can't hold them long. Calloway turned to Martinez, his decision crystallizing. Get the wounded ready to move. As soon as that thing is activated, we need to be prepared to push east, away from the blast radius if possible. Martinez looked like he wanted to argue further, but years of military discipline won out. With a curt nod, he moved to organize the wounded. Kleinman appeared at Calloway's side, his rifle clutched tightly. Sir, I want to help on the perimeter. Calloway studied the young private, noting the determined set of his jaw despite the fear in his eyes. All right, but stay low and conserve ammunition. This isn't about holding ground, it's about buying time. As Kleinman hurried away, Calloway moved to where Kovalchuk was making final adjustments to the device. The blue luminescence in the central, Chamber had intensified, pulsing with an unsettling rhythm. "How much longer?" Calloway asked. "Is ready?" Kovalchuk replied, his voice tight with tension. "But final warning, Lieutenant. Once activated, pulse will affect everything in radius, friend and foe alike. Our own equipment, weapons, but not the mechanical functions of our rifles," Calloway confirmed. "No, not bolt-action rifles, is only electrical systems. But compasses will fail, radios, anything with wiring or circuitry." "And the side effects you mentioned? How quickly do they manifest?" Kovalchuk's expression was grim. "In tests almost immediately for some, others, hours later, is unpredictable." The gunfire from the perimeter intensified, punctuated by the distinctive sound of a German MG-42 machine gun. They were running out of time. "Calloway!" Harrison's voice shouted over the din. "They're flanking north. We can't hold." The lieutenant made his decision. "Everyone fall back to central position. Kovalchuk, stand by to activate on my order." As his men retreated from the perimeter, forming a tight circle around the device, Calloway noticed a figure emerging from the tree line. Not a common soldier, but an officer, directing the German advance with calculated precision. Through his binoculars, Calloway could make out the rank insignia of a Hauptmann, a captain. "All men accounted for?" Calloway asked, as Harrison joined them, blood streaming from a graze on his cheek. "Doyle's hit bad," Harrison reported grimly. "Won't make it. Everyone else is here." Calloway absorbed this news with a sharp nod. Another name to add to the list he carried in his mind, men lost under his command. The German fire was intensifying, bullets thudding into trees around them. They had minutes, perhaps seconds, before they would be overrun. "Kovalchuk," Calloway said, "activate the device." The engineer's hand hovered over the final switch. "Lieutenant, I must be clear. What happens next, it cannot be undone." "I understand," Calloway replied. "Do it." Martinez stepped forward, his expression anguished. "Red, wait." But it was too late. Kovalchuk pressed the switch and a high-pitched whine emanated from the device, building in intensity until it was almost painful to hear. The blue luminescence in the central chamber flared brilliantly, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. "Cover your eyes!" Kovalchuk shouted, throwing himself flat on the ground. A blinding flash erupted from the device, followed by a concussive wave that wasn't sound or wind but something else entirely, like the air itself was being compressed and expanded in rapid sequence. Calloway felt it pass through his body, a sensation both alien and disturbing, as if every cell was being minutely rearranged. Then came the silence, profound, absolute, almost oppressive in its totality. The German gunfire had ceased. Even the forest sounds, birds, wind in the trees, had vanished, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Slowly, Calloway raised his head. The device was still pulsing with blue light, but softer now, rhythmic like a heartbeat. His men were picking themselves up, checking weapons, looking around in confusion at the sudden quiet. "Did it work?" Kleinman asked, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Harrison," Calloway ordered, "take 2 men and check the perimeter. I want to know what's happening out there." As Harrison moved to comply, Martinez approached Calloway, his expression unreadable. "It's done then." "It's done," Calloway confirmed. "Now we find out what it means." Harrison returned minutes later, his face showing an unusual emotion for the hardened soldier, uncertainty. "Lieutenant, you need to see this," he said simply. Calloway followed him to the edge of the clearing, with Martinez and Kovalchuk close behind. What they saw would haunt Calloway's nightmares for years to come. The German forces were visible through the trees, but something was terribly wrong. They weren't advancing, retreating, or taking cover. They were completely motionless, frozen, in place like statues. Some had been caught mid-stride, others with rifles half raised. Their officer, the Hauptmann, stood with his arm extended in a commanding gesture, his mouth open in a shout that would never be heard. "My God," Martinez whispered. "What happened to them?" Kovalchuk's face had gone the color of ash. "Is worse than I feared. The pulse. It has affected not just electronics, but time itself. Time, Calloway repeated incredulously. Is theoretical possibility we discussed but never observed. Electromagnetic field so intense it creates localized temporal distortion. You're saying we've frozen them in time? Martinez asked, horror evident in his voice. Is more complicated, Kovalchuk replied. Not frozen exactly. Slowed to imperceptible rate. For them, perhaps only milliseconds are passing. For us, he trailed off, clearly disturbed by the implications of what they were witnessing. How long will they stay like this? Calloway demanded. Kovalchuk shook his head helplessly. I do not know. Minutes, hours, maybe longer. And then what happens? They will resume normal temporal flow, but the effects on human physiology, impossible to predict. Kleinman, who had joined them, took an involuntary step back. Sir, this isn't right. This isn't war anymore. Calloway had to agree. They had crossed a line, a boundary between conventional warfare and something else entirely. Something mankind was perhaps never meant to wield. Harrison, however, saw only the tactical advantage. We can walk right through their lines, he said, a note of awe in his voice. Hell, we could shoot every last one of them, and they couldn't, even blink. No, Calloway said firmly. No one touches them. We don't know what might happen if we interfere with whatever this is. We move out, due east, now. As they prepared to leave, Calloway found himself unable to look away from the frozen Germans, particularly the Hauptmann. There was something profoundly disturbing about seeing fellow soldiers, even enemies, reduced to living statues. What about the device? Martinez asked. We destroy it, Calloway decided immediately. Set charges, enough to obliterate it completely. As they gathered the wounded and prepared to move out, Calloway noticed Kovalchuk staring at the frozen Germans with an expression of mingled horror and fascination. You knew this could happen, didn't you? He asked the engineer quietly. Kovalchuk's eyes met his. Was theoretical possibility only, never observed in tests. But you suspected. The engineer nodded slowly. This is why I tried to delay deployment. Science has boundaries for a reason, Lieutenant. Today we have crossed one. The charges were set with a 10-minute timer, long enough for them to put distance between themselves and the blast, but hopefully short enough to prevent the device from being recovered if the temporal effect wore off quickly. As they moved out, passing silently between the frozen German soldiers, Calloway couldn't shake the feeling that they had unleashed something they could never fully understand or control. The weapon had given them a chance at survival, yes, but at what cost? Martinez fell into step beside him, his face grim. This isn't war anymore, Red, he said quietly. This is something else, something we weren't meant to meddle with. Behind them, the distant thunder of the charges detonating echoed through the forest, the final punctuation on a chapter of warfare that crossed beyond conventional boundaries. The device was destroyed, but Calloway knew with bone-deep certainty that what they had witnessed, what they had unleashed, would have consequences far beyond this forgotten corner of the Ardennes forest. Consequences that would follow them long after the frozen Germans faded from sight, and perhaps long after this war itself had ended. The blue light faded from the forest, but its effects lingered like an invisible stain. Calloway and his men stood in stunned silence as they witnessed the aftermath of their desperate gambit. What had been an organized German assault moments before was now utter chaos. German radios sputtered with death static before falling silent. Vehicle engines coughed and died. The systematic artillery fire that had been sweeping the forest abruptly ceased, leaving an unnatural quiet broken only by confused German shouts. And the German soldiers themselves, those not caught in the time distortion, staggered like drunk men, clutching their heads, disoriented and bewildered. It worked, Kleinman whispered, his young voice caught between awe and horror. Kovalchuk said nothing. The engineer stood rigidly, watching the havoc unfold with the haunted expression of a man who had unleashed something he'd long feared. Lieutenant? Harrison's voice cut through the silence. The corporal's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light as he gestured toward the disoriented Germans. "They're sitting ducks. We should move now." Calloway hesitated, surveying the unnatural battlefield. They had an opening, a chance to escape the trap that had seemed inescapable minutes before. But as he watched German soldiers stumbling blindly, some collapsing to their knees vomiting, others staring at nothing with blood trickling from their ears, he felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't combat. This was something else entirely. "We move east," he finally ordered. "Gather the wounded. Our objective is to reach Allied lines." Harrison's expression darkened. "East? Through the forest? That's at least 8 miles of rough terrain with wounded men." He pointed at the disorganized Germans. "The road is right there, and these bastards can't even stand up straight, much less fight." "We're not engaging unless we have to," Calloway replied firmly. "Red," Martinez interjected, his voice low and urgent. "Harrison's right about one thing. We can't make it through the forest with the wounded. Not in this cold. Not in their condition." Calloway knew they were right, but something about the scene before him made him reluctant to advance directly through the Germans, even in their vulnerable state. It felt wrong, dishonorable somehow, but honor wouldn't keep his men alive. "All right," he conceded. "We take the road, but only after we're sure it's clear. Harrison, you and Johnson scout ahead. Martinez, get the wounded ready to move." As the men dispersed to their tasks, Calloway noticed Kovalchuk staring intently at the glowing device they'd failed to destroy completely. The engineer's face had gone deathly pale. "Kovalchuk, what is it?" "Device should have powered down after initial pulse," he replied, his voice trembling. "But it's still active, still emitting field. Effect will continue to spread and intensify." Before Calloway could process this disturbing information, gunfire erupted from the direction of the German lines, sporadic and disorganized, the desperate shots of panicked men firing at shadows. "Lieutenant," one of his men called from the perimeter. "Germans approaching from the north." Calloway raised his binoculars and saw a small group of German soldiers staggering toward them. Unlike the others, these men moved with purpose, albeit unsteadily. At their center walked an officer, tall, composed despite a trickle of blood from one ear, his uniform marking him as a Hauptmann. "Reinhardt?" Kovalchuk whispered, recognition flashing in his eyes. Calloway glanced at him sharply. "You know him?" "His name, Otto Reinhardt, from intelligence briefings. Tactical genius, they say. Ruthless commander." Calloway studied the German officer through his binoculars. Despite the obvious disorientation affecting him, Reinhardt's cold eyes scanned the forest with calculating precision. "He's looking for the source of the pulse," Kovalchuk said. "He understands what has happened." "Then we don't give him time to regroup," Calloway decided. "All units prepare to move out. Harrison, clear the road ahead." Harrison nodded eagerly, selecting 3 men to accompany him. As they moved toward the edge of the clearing, Calloway turned to the rest of his squad. "Once we hit the road, we move fast. No stopping, no engaging unless absolutely necessary. We all make it out, or none of us do." What happened next would haunt Calloway's dreams for years to come. Harrison and his small team had barely reached the road when a German vehicle, a light reconnaissance car that had somehow survived the electromagnetic pulse, came around the bend. The Germans inside appeared dazed but functional. Upon seeing the Americans, the driver slammed on the brakes while the soldier in the passenger seat raised his rifle. Harrison reacted with cold efficiency. His first shot took the gunner through the throat. His second and third dropped the driver and another German exiting the back of the vehicle. But Harrison didn't stop there. As the remaining German stumbled, out with his hands raised in surrender, Harrison shot him point blank in the chest. "Road's clear, Lieutenant," he called back as casually as if he were reporting the weather. Martinez's jaw tightened. That man was surrendering. "He was a threat," Harrison replied coldly. "Enough," Calloway cut in. "We move now. Martinez, take point with Harrison. Kleinman, you're with me and the wounded." As they emerged from the forest onto the road, The full extent of the weapon's impact became apparent. German vehicles stood, abandoned, some with engines still smoking. Soldiers lay where they had fallen, some unconscious, others disoriented and sick. The few who retained the presence of mind to recognize the Americans as enemies were too incapacitated to offer meaningful resistance. "Look at them," Kleinman murmured, his young face troubled. "It's like they've all been poisoned." "Neural disruption," Kovalchuk explained grimly. "Electrical activity in brain is highly sensitive to electromagnetic fields. This is just beginning." "Beginning of what?" Calloway asked. Before Kovalchuk could answer, more gunfire erupted ahead. Harrison had encountered another group of Germans, these more organized than the last. Under the direction of a sergeant who seemed less affected than his men, they had formed a hasty defensive position in the ditch beside the road. Harrison didn't hesitate. He charged the position, firing as he went. 2 Germans fell immediately. The others, hampered by whatever neurological effects the pulse had inflicted, returned fire inaccurately. Martinez joined the attack, more methodical, but equally lethal. Within moments, the Germans were dead or fleeing. "Keep moving," Calloway ordered, pushing the column forward. They advanced down the road, encountering sporadic resistance that grew less coordinated with each passing minute. The weapon's effects appeared to be intensifying, just as Kovalchuk had warned. Germans who had initially been merely disoriented were now collapsing unconscious or thrashing in seizures. "This isn't right," Martinez muttered as they passed a group of Germans convulsing on the ground. "This isn't war. It's survival," Calloway replied, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. From the rear of their column, Kovalchuk called out in alarm, "Lieutenant, the field is following us." Calloway turned to see a subtle distortion in the air behind them, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But this was the dead of winter. "The temporal effect," Kovalchuk explained, his voice tight with fear. "It's spreading. Device must have been more unstable than I thought." "You said you destroyed it," Calloway reminded him. "Physical components, yes. But field it generated is self-sustaining now, like chain reaction." Harrison, who had returned from securing the road ahead, overheard the exchange. His blood-spattered face lit up with a disturbing enthusiasm. "You mean the weapon is still working, still taking out Krauts even without the device?" He laughed, a harsh, cold sound. "It's a miracle. We need to push forward, hit them while they're down. We could wipe out an entire battalion." "No," Calloway said firmly. "Our mission is to reach Allied lines, not to engage in unnecessary combat." "Unnecessary?" Harrison's eyes narrowed. "These are the same bastards who've been shelling us for days, the same ones who killed Reynolds and Wilson. Now we finally have the upper hand and you want to walk away?" Before Calloway could respond, a new sound cut through the unnatural quiet. Vehicle engines approaching from the east. "Cover!" Martinez shouted, and the squad scattered to defensive positions on both sides of the road. Around the bend came a German armored car, followed by a truck filled with soldiers. Unlike the Germans they'd encountered so far, these men seemed unaffected by the weapon's pulse. "Fresh troops," Martinez observed. "Must have been outside the eye radius when the weapon activated." The Germans spotted the Americans and opened fire immediately. Machine gun rounds tore through the air, forcing Calloway and his men to press themselves deeper into cover. "Return fire," Calloway ordered. "Aim for the gunner." His squad responded with a ragged volley that fell short of its mark. The German machine gunner adjusted his aim, pinning them down with accurate fire that struck uncomfortably close to where the wounded had been placed. "We need to flank them," Martinez suggested, eyes calculating distances and angles. But before they could organize a counterattack, something unexpected happened. The advancing Germans suddenly faltered. The machine gun fire became erratic, then ceased altogether. Through his binoculars, Calloway watched in astonishment as the German gunner clutched his head, swayed, and collapsed over his weapon. "The pulse," Kovalchuk said. "It's reached them." The Germans were succumbing to the same disorientation that had afflicted the others. The armored car swerved off the road as its driver lost control. The infantry stumbled and fell, dropping weapons, as they clutched at their heads. "Now!" Harrison shouted, rising from cover with his rifle raised. "Take them while they're down." Before Calloway could countermand the order, Harrison charged forward, firing methodically at the incapacitated Germans. Two of the squad's younger soldiers followed his example, caught up in the blood fever that seemed to have gripped the corporal. "Harrison, stand down!" Calloway roared, but his command went unheeded. Martinez looked to him, awaiting orders, his expression conflicted. "Red, what do we do?" Calloway watched as Harrison reached the Germans and began executing the defenseless men with mechanical precision. It was a massacre, not a battle, yet these were the same Germans who had been hunting them mercilessly, who would have shown no mercy had the situations been reversed. "Secure the vehicles," he finally ordered. "We could use the transport, but no unnecessary killing, understood?" Martinez nodded and moved out, gathering the more level-headed members of the squad. Calloway turned to Kovalchuk, who was staring at the unfolding scene with a mixture of horror and guilt. "How far will this spread?" Calloway demanded. "The field, the effects. When does it stop?" The engineer shook his head helplessly. "I don't know. Was never tested at this scale. Theory suggested contained radius, but a field is self-perpetuating. Could it reach Allied lines? Possibly, eventually, but effect should diminish with distance." By the time Calloway reached the German vehicles, Harrison had secured the area, a euphemism for the methodical slaughter Calloway found evidence of everywhere. Every German soldier lay dead, including those who had clearly been incapacitated before Harrison reached them. "Area clear, Lieutenant," Harrison reported, calmly reloading his rifle. Blood spattered his uniform like macabre decorations. "This wasn't necessary," Calloway said quietly. Harrison's eyes hardened. "Wasn't it? These are the same men who would have gutted us without a second thought. The same ones who've been hunting us like animals. We're soldiers, not executioners. What's the difference?" Harrison challenged. "Dead is dead. At least this way it's them instead of us." Before Calloway could respond, Martinez called from the armored car. "Engines still functional. Must have been shielded somehow." "Good." Calloway turned away from Harrison, unable to stomach the corporal's blood-soaked satisfaction any longer. "Get the wounded loaded into the truck. We're taking these vehicles." As his men scrambled to comply, Calloway surveyed the battlefield. The road was littered with German casualties, some killed by his squad, others victims of the weapon's mysterious effects. In the distance, he could see more German soldiers wandering aimlessly or lying motionless. A complete rout, a total victory, yet it left him feeling hollow. Kleinman approached, his young face troubled. "Sir, I think you should see this." The private led him to the edge of the road, where a German officer lay partially hidden in the underbrush. It was Hauptmann Reinhardt. Unlike his men, he appeared to have died not from gunfire but from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Blood had poured from his ears, nose, and eyes. "He got farther than the others," Kleinman observed. "Tried to reach our lines even as the weapon was killing him." Calloway knelt beside the fallen officer, struck by the man's determination. Even in the throes of whatever neurological horror the weapon had inflicted, Reinhardt had continued his mission. Soldier to the last. "Lieutenant," Martinez called, urgently. "We need to move, now." Looking up, Calloway saw what had alarmed his sergeant. The strange distortion in the air, the temporal effect, was spreading visibly now like ripples in a pond. Everywhere it touched, German soldiers froze mid-motion, caught in the same unnatural stasis they had witnessed earlier. "Everyone in the vehicles," Calloway ordered, rising quickly. "Move out." They piled into the captured German transport, wounded in the back of the truck, fighting men in the armored car. Kovalchuk hesitated before boarding, his gaze fixed on the spreading distortion. "It's accelerating," he said, almost to himself. "Field stability collapsing." "What does that mean for us?" Calloway demanded. "It means we must outrun it, Lieutenant." The engineer's voice was grim. "Or we join these Germans in temporal stasis, perhaps permanently." As they roared down the road, pushing the captured vehicles to their limits, Calloway watched the chaos unfold in their wake. The weapon they had unleashed was consuming the battlefield behind them, leaving a swath of frozen Germans in its path. Martinez sat beside him in the armored car, his expression troubled. "This isn't what I enlisted for, Red. Shooting men who can't shoot back. Using weapons that do this. Would you rather be back there outgunned and surrounded?" Harrison challenged from the gunner's position. "This is war. We use every advantage we can get." "There are lines, Harrison. Rules." "Rules?" Harrison laughed bitterly. "Tell that to the Germans." Calloway listened to the argument without intervening. Both men were right in their way. War had rules, lines that separated soldiers from barbarians. But those rules had been written for conventional weapons, conventional tactics. What they had unleashed today was something else entirely. He glanced at Kleinman, who sat silently, staring at the road ahead. The young private had changed in the past 24 hours, the innocent recruit replaced by a soldier who had seen the darkest face of warfare. "You okay, Mouse?" Calloway asked quietly. Kleinman looked up, startled by the question. "Yes, sir, He hesitated. "Is this what winning feels like?" Calloway had no answer for that. They had survived, achieved a victory against impossible odds. Yet victory had never tasted so bitter. In the truck behind them, Kovalchuk sat, among the wounded, his eyes never leaving the distortion spreading across the landscape. His expression was that of a man watching his worst fears realized, a scientist confronting the terrible power of his creation. The vehicles pushed eastward, leaving behind a battlefield unlike any in the history of warfare. A battlefield where time itself had become a weapon, and conventional morality had been left behind like spent shell casings. They had unleashed hell on their enemies. But Calloway couldn't shake the feeling that hell once unleashed would not be easily contained, and that the true consequences of their desperate act were only beginning to unfold. 5 miles east of the initial contact point, Calloway ordered the vehicles to halt. The road ahead split into a Y junction, one path continuing eastward toward what he hoped were American lines, the other veering north toward a small German-occupied town, marked on their maps as Diekirch. The armored car's engine ticked as it cooled in the bitter winter air. No sounds of pursuit came from behind them, only the eerie silence of a battlefield unnaturally stilled. The weapon's effects had bought them precious time and distance. "We need to ditch these vehicles," Martinez said, scanning the surroundings with practiced vigilance. "Germans will be looking for them." Calloway nodded. "We'll continue on foot from here, east through the forest." Harrison, who had been unusually quiet during their drive, suddenly straightened from his position at the rear gun. "East?" His voice carried a dangerous edge. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, that's the wrong direction. Our mission is to reach American lines," Calloway replied evenly. "Our mission was to deliver that weapon," Harrison countered, jumping down from the vehicle. "That mission's done. Now we have a new opportunity." He gestured northward. "Diekirch, German command post, the heart of their operation in this sector." Calloway's eyes narrowed. "What about it?" "They're sitting ducks." Harrison's face lit with a fervor that bordered on mania. "That pulse knocked out everything for miles. Radios, vehicles, artillery. Half their men are probably still drooling on themselves. We could roll right in there and wipe them out." "That's not our objective," Calloway said firmly. "Not our objective?" Harrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. "Red, think about it. We could do in an hour what an entire battalion couldn't accomplish in a week. We could cut the heart out of the German operation in this sector." "And get ourselves killed in the process," Martinez interjected. "We've got wounded men, limited ammunition. We should take this miracle for what it is, a chance to get out alive." Harrison's face darkened. "A chance for more than that. A chance for payback." "Payback isn't our job," Martinez countered. "Isn't it?" Harrison's voice rose. "Tell that to Reynolds. Tell that to Wilson. Tell that to every man we've lost because These German bastards wouldn't quit. Now we finally have them on their knees and you want to just walk away? The rest of the squad had gathered around, watching the confrontation with uneasy expressions. Calloway could see the division forming, some nodding in agreement with Harrison, others looking to Martinez or to him for guidance. Kovalchuk, who had been examining the map, approached with tentative steps. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "there is something else to consider." "What is it?" The engineer pointed to their current position. "We are approximately 5 miles from weapon activation point. Field effects are still manifesting around us, yes? But diminishing in intensity. Your point? The phenomenon may be temporary, localized. If we move quickly, we can escape its radius before... Before what?" Martinez pressed. Kovalchuk hesitated. "Before potential reversal." "Reversal?" Calloway focused intently on the engineer. "What does that mean exactly?" "In laboratory, some test subjects experienced recovery, return to normal function, sometimes with enhanced aggression, as if body compensates for period of weakness with surge of adrenaline." A cold weight settled in Calloway's stomach. "You're saying the Germans we left behind, the ones affected by the pulse, they might recover, and when they do, they'll be even more dangerous than before?" Kovalchuk nodded grimly. "Is theoretical possibility, never observed at this scale but consistent with test results. This new information cast their situation in a different light. What had seemed like a decisive victory might only be a temporary advantage, one that could reverse itself at any moment. All the more reason to hit them now," Harrison urged, "while they're still down. Finish the job. Or all the more reason to put as much distance between us and them as possible," Martinez argued. Calloway studied the map, weighing their limited options. To the east lay potential safety, but through miles of forest in the dead of winter with wounded men. To the north lay Diekirch, a German stronghold now potentially vulnerable, but still defended by soldiers who might be recovering even as they spoke. Before he could announce his decision, Kleinman, who had been keeping watch, called out in alarm. "Lieutenant, light in the sky to the west." They all turned to see a flare arcing high above the tree line, painting the winter sky with a harsh red glow. A second followed, then a third, forming a pattern that could only be deliberate. "Signal flares," Martinez murmured. "They're organizing." "Not possible," Kovalchuk protested. "Electronic systems should still be disabled." "They don't need electronics for flare guns," Calloway pointed out, "or for runners carrying messages." Harrison snorted. "So some crowd officer is trying to rally his men with fireworks. So what? They're still blind, deaf, and dumb compared to what they were an hour ago." As if in response to his dismissal, distant gunfire erupted from the west, sporadic at first, then more coordinated, not the panicked shooting of disoriented men, but the disciplined volley of soldiers under command. "They're recovering," Martinez said grimly. "Faster than expected." Calloway made his decision. "We move east now. Everyone grab what you can carry from the vehicles. Leave nothing useful behind." Harrison's face contorted with rage. "You're running? After what we've done to them? After what they've done to us?" "I'm completing our mission," Calloway replied firmly. "And that means getting my men to safety." "Your men?" Harrison laughed bitterly. "Look around you, Red. Your men want to fight. They want to finish this." Calloway scanned the faces of his squad. Harrison wasn't entirely wrong. Several of the younger soldiers nodded their agreement. The taste of power, of seeing the Germans who had hunted them now rendered helpless, had awakened something primal in them. "This isn't a democracy," Calloway said. "We move east. That's an order." For a tense moment, Harrison looked like he might openly defy the command. Then, with deliberate slowness, he shouldered his rifle. "Yes, sir," he said, the words dripping with contempt. As the squad prepared to move out, destroying the vehicle's engines and salvaging what supplies they could, Calloway pulled Martinez and Kovalchuk aside. "How long do we have before they're at full strength again?" he asked the engineer. Kovalchuk shook his head helplessly. "Hours, maybe. Perhaps less for some. Depends on individual resilience and degree of exposure. And the temporal effect, the distortion we saw, is different. Phenomenon may continue to spread independent of other effects. Martinez studied Calloway's expression. You've got that look, Red. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Harrison may have a point, even if his motives are wrong, Calloway admitted. If the Germans recover and regroup before we reach our lines, we're back to being hunted. But if we can disrupt their command structure while they're still vulnerable, you want to hit Diekirch, Martinez realized. Not as an assault force. Small team in and out. Disrupt communications. Eliminate officers if possible, then fade away. Buy us the time we need to get our wounded to safety. Martinez considered this. It's risky, but better than Harrison's suicidal frontal assault. Who would you take? Kovalchuk asked. Harrison, for one, Calloway decided. Better to have him where I can see him. 2 more volunteers. The rest of you continue east with the wounded. Martinez shook his head firmly. If you're going, I'm going. Someone needs to make sure you two don't kill each other. Before Calloway could respond, new flares rose from the west, these forming a different pattern, green instead of red. Almost immediately, the distant gunfire intensified, and now it seemed to be advancing. They're not just recovering, Martinez observed. They're counterattacking. Calloway made a rapid calculation. Change of plans. We all move north toward Diekirch. There's a stream and a ridgeline on the map that could provide better defensive position than this open road. And then? Martinez asked. Then we make a stand if we have to, but our priority remains getting our wounded to safety. The order was given and the squad moved out, abandoning the vehicles and striking north through the forest. The wounded struggled, but there was a new urgency in their movements. The distant gunfire was motivation enough. They had been moving for less than an hour when they encountered the first sign that the weapon's effects were indeed temporary. A German patrol, 6 men moving with evident purpose, nearly collided with their column in a narrow ravine. What followed was brief and brutal. Harrison, at point, dispatched 2 Germans before they could raise their weapons. Martinez eliminated a third. The remaining Germans returned fire, striking one of Calloway's men in the shoulder before Kleinman, with unexpected precision, dropped them with 2 quick shots. They're recovered, Harrison said, kneeling to examine one of the dead Germans. No blood from the ears, no signs of the pulse effects. Check their equipment, Calloway ordered. A quick search confirmed their fears. The Germans' radio was functioning again. Their weapons showed no signs of the electromagnetic disruption that had disabled similar equipment earlier. The effect is wearing off, Kovalchuk confirmed, examining the radio with a scientist's detachment. Faster than I anticipated. How is that possible? Martinez demanded. Kovalchuk's expression was troubled. Perhaps the device was damaged during activation. Perhaps the field is unstable. The implication hung in the air. If the weapon's effects were already wearing off, their temporary advantage might be evaporating even faster than they feared. We need to move, Calloway decided. Double time. They pushed north, the distant sound of German counterattack spurring them forward. The wounded struggled to keep pace, but fear proved a powerful motivator. As they crested a wooded ridge, Calloway called a brief halt to get their bearings. Below them, nestled in a small valley, lay Diekirch, a cluster of stone, buildings surrounding a church steeple, with a larger structure that might be a headquarters on the northern edge. Even from this distance they could see activity, troops gathering, vehicles being checked. They're preparing to move out, Martinez observed. Recovering faster than we thought. Calloway studied the scene through his binoculars. Something about the Germans' movement struck him as odd. They weren't just recovering, they were organizing with unusual efficiency, as if they'd drilled for this exact scenario. And then he saw him, a tall figure striding among the troops, gesturing with precise authority. Even at this distance, there was something familiar about his bearing, his uniform. Kovalchuk, Calloway called, passing the binoculars. Is that who I think it is? The engineer looked, then went very still. Reinhardt, he whispered. But Not possible. We saw him dead. Apparently not dead enough, Harrison muttered. Calloway took back the binoculars for another look. There was no mistake. Hauptmann Otto Reinhardt, the German officer they'd seen collapsed by the roadside, blood streaming from his eyes and ears, was very much alive and in command. How? Martinez asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Kovalchuk's face had gone ashen. The reversal. Some subjects showed remarkable recovery, but never from that level of exposure, never from the brink of death. Well, he's recovered now, Calloway said grimly, and he's mobilizing every German in the area. Through his binoculars, Calloway could see that Reinhardt wasn't using radios or electronic equipment. Instead, he was deploying runners with written orders and organizing his forces using flags and flares. Simple, pre-electronic methods that the weapon couldn't disrupt. He's adapting, Calloway realized with grudging admiration, using old-school tactics to compensate for the technology loss. Smart, Martinez conceded, and dangerous for us. Harrison, who had been scanning the German position with predatory focus, suddenly pointed. Look there, by the church. They're setting up mortars. Sure enough, German soldiers were positioning light mortars on the village square. Without electronic targeting systems, their accuracy would be reduced, but they'd still be deadly if Calloway's squad was spotted. We need to decide, Lieutenant, Martinez said urgently. Do we try to slip past them to the east, or do we hit them before they're fully organized? It was the question Calloway had been wrestling with since they'd first seen the effects of the weapon. Retreat and survive, or press their advantage even as it slipped away. Harrison didn't wait for his commander's decision. We hit them, he stated flatly. Hard and fast. Take out Reinhardt and those mortars, and the rest will fall apart. With what? Martinez challenged. We've got 14 men, 5 of them wounded. Limited ammunition, no support. We've got surprise, Harrison countered. They don't know we're here. We can approach from the forest, hit the command post, and be gone before they know what happened. Calloway studied the German position again. Harrison's plan was reckless but not entirely without merit. A targeted strike against the leadership might buy them the time they needed to escape, but it would mean leaving their wounded vulnerable while the strike team was away. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kleinman, he called. Come here. The young private approached, his face showing a composure that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Combat had aged him, hardened him in ways that training never could. Sir? I'm leaving you in charge of the wounded. Martinez, Harrison, Kovalchuk, and I are going to conduct a limited strike on that command post. You'll take the rest of the squad east, toward this stream here. He indicated the location on the map. It leads toward our lines. Follow it until you reach this junction, then wait for us. If we're not there by nightfall, keep moving. Kleinman's eyes widened slightly. You're trusting me with the wounded, sir? Can you handle it, Private? The young man straightened. Yes, sir, I won't let you down. As Kleinman moved to organize the withdrawal, Martinez approached Calloway with concern etched on his face. Red, splitting our forces is risky. If something goes wrong, everything about this situation is risky, Calloway cut him off. But this gives our wounded the best chance of reaching safety, while still allowing us to disrupt the German counterattack. And bringing Kovalchuk? Martinez questioned. He's not a combat soldier. He understands the weapon better than any of us. If there are lingering effects we can use to our advantage, we need his expertise. The decision made, they quickly divided supplies and ammunition. As the main group prepared to move east under Kleinman's guidance, Calloway pulled the young private aside for a final word. If we don't make it to the rendezvous by nightfall, don't wait, he instructed. Get our men to safety, that's an order. Kleinman nodded solemnly. Good luck, sir. As the wounded and their escorts disappeared into the forest, Calloway turned to his small strike team. Harrison checked his rifle with methodical precision, his face set in grim anticipation. Martinez studied the map one last time, committing escape routes to memory. Kovalchuk stood apart, his expression troubled. "Something on your mind, Victor?" Calloway asked. The engineer met his gaze with haunted eyes. Reinhardt should not have survived. The level of exposure he experienced, it should have been fatal. "Yet there he is," Calloway pointed out. "Yes, there he is." Kovalchuk's voice dropped lower, but perhaps not as he was before. "What do you mean?" "In some test subjects, extreme exposure led to changes, not just physical, neurological, psychological." "You're saying the weapon might have affected his mind?" Martinez asked. "Is possibility," Kovalchuk admitted. "The electrical pathways of brain, when disrupted and then reformed, sometimes create new patterns." "So he might be crazy," Harrison summarized bluntly. "All the more reason to put a bullet in him." "Or he might be something else entirely," Kovalchuk warned. "Something we do not understand." Calloway absorbed this disturbing possibility. Every new revelation about the weapon made their decision to use it seem more questionable, but that was a reckoning for another time. Right now, they had a mission. "We move in 15 minutes, he ordered. "Harrison, you're on point. Martinez, you cover our withdrawal. Kovalchuk stays with me. We hit the command post, eliminate Reinhardt if possible, then extract immediately. No heroics, no extended engagement." As they prepared for the assault, Calloway caught a final glimpse of Reinhardt. Through his binoculars, the German officer was standing perfectly still amid the bustle of preparations, his face turned toward the ridge where they were hiding, as if he somehow sensed their presence. A chill ran down Calloway's spine. Whatever they had unleashed with that weapon, whatever power they had tampered with, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were now facing the consequences, and those consequences wore the face of Hauptmann Otto Reinhardt, a man who should be dead, but instead was preparing to hunt them down. The price of power, it seemed, was only beginning to be paid. The first mortar round exploded 50 yards from Kleinman's position, showering the forest floor with dirt and splintered wood. The second landed closer, the third closer still. The Germans were walking their fire toward them with methodical precision. "Keep moving," Kleinman shouted to the wounded men in his charge. "They're bracketing our position." After separating from Calloway's strike team, Kleinman had led his group eastward through the dense Ardennes forest. For the first hour, they'd made good progress despite the burden of the wounded. Then came the distant pop of mortar tubes, followed seconds later by the signature whistle of incoming shells. Somehow the Germans had found them. Private Wilson, his leg bandaged from a shrapnel wound, stumbled and fell. Kleinman doubled back, hauling the man to his feet with strength he didn't know he possessed. "Leave me," Wilson gasped. "I'm slowing you down." "Not happening," Kleinman replied firmly. "We all make it out, or none of us do. Lieutenant's orders." The mention of Calloway steadied Wilson, and he nodded grimly. They pressed forward, following a narrow game trail that snaked through the trees. Behind them, the mortar fire continued, its systematic pursuit, each round landing closer than the last. "Sir," one of the other privates called out, "how are they tracking us? We're under heavy cover. They can't possibly see us." Kleinman had been wondering the same thing. Without radios or electronic tracking devices, the Germans should have been firing blind. Instead, they seemed to know exactly where his group was, moving. "Someone's spotting for them," he realized aloud. "They've got eyes on us somewhere." Even as he spoke, a rifle shot cracked through the forest. One of his men cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell. A sniper. "Cover," Kleinman ordered, dragging the wounded man behind a fallen tree. The rest of the squad scattered, seeking what protection they could find. Another shot. A bullet splintered bark inches from Kleinman's head. The sniper was good. Too good. And he was zeroing in on their position. 2 miles northwest, Calloway's strike team had worked their way to the outskirts of Diekirch. Under the cover of gathering dusk, they observed the German command post from the edge of the forest. The headquarters, a requisitioned stone building that might once have been a small manor house, buzzed with activity. Messengers came and went. Officers gathered around maps spread on outdoor tables, and standing in the center of it all, directing operations with calm authority, was Hauptmann Otto Reinhardt. "He's got the place locked down tight," Martinez observed. "Guards at every approach, overlapping fields of fire." "And they're spreading out search parties," Harrison added, nodding toward a group of German soldiers forming up nearby. "Methodical. Grid search pattern. Old school but effective." Calloway studied the scene through his binoculars. Reinhardt's counteroffensive was unfolding with remarkable efficiency, especially considering the technological disadvantage the Germans were operating under. No radios, no motorized vehicles, no electronic targeting systems, yet they were compensating with pre-modern military discipline that was, in its way, just as effective. "He knows we're out here," Calloway said quietly, "and he knows exactly what we're capable of." "Then we should hit them hard and fast," Harrison urged. "Take out Reinhardt, and as many officers as we can, then fade back into the forest." "With what?" Martinez challenged. "Even with surprise on our side, we're outnumbered 20-1. We've faced worse odds." "Not like this," Martinez gestured toward the German position. "Look at them. They're not disoriented anymore. They're coordinated, disciplined. Reinhardt's got them operating like a well-oiled machine even without their technology." Calloway knew Martinez was right. What had seemed like a viable hit-and-run mission just hours ago now looked like a suicide operation. But retreating meant abandoning any hope of disrupting the German counteroffensive, and potentially leaving Kleinman and the wounded exposed to Reinhardt's methodical sweep of the forest. Before he could decide, Kovalchuk gasped sharply beside him. "Lieutenant," the engineer whispered, his voice tight with alarm. "Look at Reinhardt, his eyes." Calloway raised the binoculars again, focusing on the German officer's face. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. Reinhardt's eyes reflected the fading daylight with an unnatural blue luminescence, the same eerie glow they had seen in the weapons core. "My God," Calloway breathed. "What's happening to him?" "The field effects," Kovalchuk replied, his face ashen. "They've integrated into his neural pathways. He's not just recovered from the pulse, he's changed by it." "Changed how?" Martinez demanded. "I don't know. Was theoretical possibility only. Never observed in humans." The engineer's voice trembled. "But if field has directly affected his brain function, who knows what capabilities he might have developed." "You're saying he's what, psychic now?" Harrison scoffed. "Reading minds?" "Not reading minds," Kovalchuk corrected grimly, "but perhaps sensing disturbances in electromagnetic field, like primitive radar, using biological organs instead of technology." The implication hung in the air between them. If Reinhardt could somehow sense their presence, their plans, their movements, through some biological adaptation to the weapon's effects, then they weren't just facing superior numbers. They were facing an enemy who could anticipate their every move. "We need to pull back," Calloway decided. "Regroup with Kleinman and the wounded, then make for Allied lines." Harrison opened his mouth to protest, but a distant sound stopped him. The distinctive crump of mortar fire, followed by the muffled thuds of impact. "That's coming from the east," Martinez said, suddenly alert. "Where Kleinman's group should be." "They've found them," Calloway realized. "Reinhardt's got every available German combing the forest." "Then we're too late," Harrison said flatly. "They're already pinned down. If we pull back now, we're abandoning them to die." For once, Harrison's bloodthirsty assessment aligned with the tactical reality. Kleinman and the wounded were in immediate danger, caught between advancing German forces and impassable terrain. Without intervention, they wouldn't survive the night. "We need a diversion," Calloway decided. "Something big enough to draw German attention away from Kleinman's position. Give them time to break contact and continue east." "Like what?" Martinez asked. Calloway's gaze drifted to the stone building serving as German headquarters. "We hit the command post. Not a surgical strike. A full-on assault. Make as much noise as possible. Draw every available German this way." "That's suicide," Martinez protested. Not if we have an ace up our sleeve, Harrison countered, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. He turned to Kovalchuk. The weapon, you said the field is still active, right? Still spreading? Yes, but could you trigger it again? Create another pulse? Harrison pressed. Kovalchuk went very still. The physical device was destroyed, but field remains, yes. Theoretically, with right electrical impulse in right location, could trigger cascade effect, amplify existing field. And that would knock them out again? Like before? Calloway asked. Perhaps, or perhaps something worse. The engineer's voice dropped to a whisper. Field has become unstable, unpredictable. Second pulse could have unforeseen consequences. We'll take that chance, Harrison declared. Hold on, Martinez cut in. Are you seriously suggesting we deliberately trigger this thing again? After everything we've seen it do? You got a better idea? Harrison challenged. Because I'm all ears, Sergeant. Martinez turned to Calloway. Red, this is insanity. We have no idea what a second pulse might do. To the Germans, to us, to Kleinman, and his men, we need to find another way. Calloway's mind raced through their limited options. A conventional attack on the headquarters would almost certainly fail. Retreating meant leaving Kleinman's group exposed. Doing nothing was not an option. That left only the weapon. The devil. They knew, yet didn't understand. Kovalchuk, he said finally, if we were to trigger another pulse, how would we do it? And where? The engineer's expression was pained. Would need power source, strong electrical current, and ideally location where field is already concentrated. Like where we originally activated the device, Calloway suggested. No, field has shifted, moved with German movements, almost as if. He trailed off, his scientific mind apparently struggling with an implausible conclusion. As if what? Martinez pressed. As if it's following Reinhardt, Kovalchuk admitted reluctantly, concentrating around him, like he's become focal point. Harrison let out a low whistle. So we need to get close to him, then trigger this thing? If we did, pulse would be magnified, but Lieutenant, Kovalchuk's voice took on a desperate edge. I must emphasize, consequences could be catastrophic, unpredictable, for everyone in area. Including us, Martinez added grimly. Calloway weighed the warnings against the sounds of mortar fire in the distance, Kleinman and the wounded, fighting for their lives. Sometimes a commander had to make impossible choices. We proceed with the plan, he decided. Kovalchuk, what do you need to trigger the pulse? The engineer's shoulders slumped in defeat. Battery from vehicle, wire, and direct connection to location where field is concentrated. We've got batteries from the German trucks, Harrison offered. I pulled them before we abandoned the vehicles. Then we're set, Calloway said. Martinez, you and Harrison will create a diversion on the west side of the village. Draw as many Germans as possible away from the headquarters. Kovalchuk and I will approach from the east, get close enough to Reinhardt to trigger the pulse. Red, I'm begging you, Martinez said, his voice tight with urgency. Don't do this. We find another way. There is no other way, Calloway replied, and we're out of time. Kleinman crawled through the underbrush, his uniform soaked with sweat despite the bitter cold. The sniper's nest was close now. He could see the faint outline of a camouflaged position among the fir branches ahead. He gathered himself for the final rush when a distant explosion shattered the forest silence. The sniper immediately swiveled toward the sound, momentarily distracted. Now, Kleinman surged forward, covering the final distance in a desperate sprint. The sniper heard him at the last second, turning with startled eyes. Too late. Kleinman crashed into him, driving his knife upward with all his strength. The German gasped, then went limp. Panting, Kleinman rolled away from the dead man. The distant explosions continued. Not mortars this time, but something else. Grenades, perhaps, and small arms fire, growing in intensity. There was no time to waste. With the sniper eliminated, they needed to move immediately, take advantage of the confusion while German forces were distracted. Kleinman scrambled down the slope, returning to where Corporal Dawson guarded the wounded. "We move now," he ordered. "Lieutenant's bought us a window. We need to—" A shot cracked through the forest and Kleinman felt a hammer blow to his side. He staggered, looking down in shock at the spreading crimson stain on his uniform. A second sniper, one they hadn't spotted, had him in his sights. "Get down!" Dawson shouted, returning fire as Kleinman collapsed against a tree. The bullet had caught him high on the right side. Painful, bloody, but not immediately fatal. Still, shock was setting in, and Kleinman knew he wouldn't be able to maintain the pace they needed to escape. "Dawson," he gasped, "get the wounded moving. Head east. Follow the stream." "Not without you," Dawson replied stubbornly. "That's an order, Corporal." Kleinman pressed his hand against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. "I'll follow when I can." Dawson hesitated, torn between duty and loyalty. Then another shot splintered the tree beside them, and the decision was made for him. "We'll send help," he promised, already organizing the wounded to move out. As Dawson led the others away, Kleinman pulled himself deeper into the cover of a fallen oak, pressing a field dressing to his wound. Blood seeped between his fingers, warm against the winter cold. In the distance, the sound of battle intensified. Whatever Calloway was doing, it was drawing every available German toward the fight. Kleinman closed his eyes, offering a silent prayer for his commander and comrades. Then the forest around him suddenly went quiet, an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The air felt charged, like just before a lightning strike. And somewhere deep in his bones, Kleinman sensed that something terrible was about to happen. The diversionary attack was working. Harrison and Martinez had struck the western edge of Diekirch with a series of coordinated explosions, followed by sustained rifle fire that suggested a much larger force than just 2 men. German troops poured from the village to meet the perceived threat, leaving the headquarters building with minimal security. Using the confusion, Calloway and Kovalchuk had worked their way to the rear of the stone building. The engineer carried an improvised device, a truck battery connected to a tangle of copper wiring salvaged from German equipment. His hands trembled as he made final adjustments. "How close do we need to be?" Calloway whispered. "To Reinhardt?" "As close as possible," Kovalchuk replied, his voice tight with dread. "Field is strongest around him now." They crept toward the building's rear entrance. Inside, they could hear urgent German voices, officers responding to the attack, and one voice rose above the others, calm and authoritative. "Reinhardt, he's inside," Calloway murmured. "We need to get closer." Kovalchuk hesitated. "Lieutenant, please, one last warning. What we're about to do, it could have consequences beyond our understanding. The field has become something else. Something I never anticipated." "We don't have a choice, Victor," Calloway replied grimly. "It's this or watch our men die." They slipped through the unlocked rear door, finding themselves in a narrow hallway. Ahead, through a partially open door, they could see a large room where German officers were gathered around a map table, and at the head of the table stood Reinhardt, his eyes glowing with that unnatural blue luminescence. "Now," Calloway whispered. Kovalchuk nodded, making a final connection on his device. "When I complete circuit, pulse will trigger. Should amplify existing field effects." "Should?" "As I said, Lieutenant, we are in uncharted territory now." Calloway took a deep breath. "Do it." Kovalchuk's fingers moved to complete the connection, but before he could, Reinhardt's head snapped up. Those glowing eyes turned directly toward their hiding place as if he had heard them despite the noise and chaos. "He knows we're here," Calloway realized with sudden dread. "Natürlich weiß ich, dass du hier bist, Amerikaner," Reinhardt said, his voice carrying easily to them. "Of course I know you are here, American. Ich kann dich fühlen." "I can feel you." The German officer stepped away from the table, moving toward them with measured steps. His subordinates looked confused, unable to see or hear what had captured their commander's attention. "Do it now," Calloway urged Kovalchuk. The engineer hesitated no longer. With a decisive movement, he connected the final wire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a high-pitched whine filled the air, building rapidly in intensity until it bordered on pain. The improvised device in Kovalchuk's hands began to glow with the same eerie blue light that emanated from Reinhardt's eyes. "Lieutenant," Kovalchuk gasped, his face illuminated by the intensifying glow. "Something's wrong. The reaction, it's more powerful than I calculated." Reinhardt had stopped his advance, staring at the device with an expression of strange recognition. Then, to Calloway's astonishment, the German officer smiled. "Endlich," he said softly. Finally. The blue glow spread from the device to the air around them, creating visible ripples like heat waves. The high-pitched whine became a deep, resonant hum that Calloway could feel in his bones. "We need to get out of here," he shouted over the noise. "Now!" But it was too late. The blue light flared suddenly, blindingly bright, and a concussive wave of force radiated outward from the device. Unlike the first pulse, which had been almost imperceptible, this one was physical, a tsunami of energy that slammed Calloway against the wall. As he fought to remain conscious, he saw Reinhardt still standing, seemingly unaffected by the pulse. The German officer raised his hands, and to Calloway's horror, the blue energy seemed to flow toward him, as if he were absorbing it. Kovalchuk collapsed beside him, blood streaming from his nose and ears. "Lieutenant," he gasped, "what have we done?" Before Calloway could respond, a second pulse emanated from Reinhardt himself, a counterwave that collided with the first, creating a chaotic maelstrom of energy that filled the room with dancing blue lightning. The last thing Calloway saw before darkness claimed him was Reinhardt's face, transformed by the energy surging through him. No longer human, no longer bound by the physical laws Calloway understood. Something new, something terrible, and as consciousness slipped away, he heard Martinez's voice in his memory, warning him that some lines should never be crossed, some weapons never used. Too late, he realized the truth of those words. Far too late. Martinez knew something had gone terribly wrong the moment he saw the blue light erupting from the German headquarters. It wasn't the controlled pulse they'd witnessed before, but something wild and chaotic. Energy that shattered windows and sent tendrils of crackling blue lightning arcing skyward. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, lowering his rifle. "What did they do?" Beside him, Harrison stared at the spectacle with a mixture of awe and alarm. They had maintained their position at the western edge of Diekirch, firing sporadically to maintain the illusion of a larger force. But now, as the blue energy expanded outward from the headquarters, their diversion seemed trivial by comparison. "We need to find Calloway," Martinez decided, already moving. "Now." They hadn't gone 10 steps when the wave hit them. Unlike the first pulse, which had been nearly imperceptible, this one was a physical force, a wall of energy that knocked them both off their feet. Martinez felt it pass through his body like an icy current, setting every nerve ending alight with cold, fire. He gasped, unable to breathe for several seconds as his diaphragm spasmed. When he could finally move again, he rolled onto his side to find Harrison in similar distress, his face contorted in pain. "What the hell was that?" Harrison managed between ragged breaths. Martinez had no answer. Around them, German soldiers, who had been advancing on their position, lay scattered like broken dolls, some twitching, others ominously still. The night had gone completely silent, as if the pulse had swallowed all sound. "Red," Martinez muttered, forcing himself to his feet. "We need to find Red." Harrison nodded, still struggling to regain his composure. Together they made their way cautiously toward the center of Diekirch. As they moved, Martinez noted with growing unease that the blue energy hadn't dissipated. It hung in the air like a fog, thicker near the ground, giving the entire village an otherworldly glow. They came across the first transformed German just 2 blocks from their starting position. The soldier lay face down in the street, motionless. As they approached cautiously, guns trained on his back, the man suddenly convulsed, his body arching unnaturally. Then, with jerky, disjointed movements, he began to rise. Halt! Harrison barked, his rifle aimed at the German's chest. The soldier turned toward them, and Martinez felt his blood run cold. The man's eyes glowed with the same eerie blue luminescence they had seen in Reinhardt's. But there was something else wrong, something fundamentally broken in the blank expression. The oddly angled limbs, as if the body were being operated by someone who didn't fully understand human anatomy. When the German took a shambling step toward them, Harrison fired without hesitation a clean shot to the center mass. The impact knocked the soldier back, a dark stain spreading across his uniform. But instead of falling, he simply rocked with the force of the bullet, then continued his advance. "What the fuck?" Harrison gasped, firing again and again. 3 more rounds, each striking the German squarely in the chest, each having no more effect than the first. "Run," Martinez said, grabbing Harrison's arm. "Now." They sprinted down a side street, the sound of shuffling footsteps following behind them. As they turned a corner, Martinez risked a glance back. The German soldier was still pursuing, moving with that same unsettling gait, blood pouring from wounds that should have been fatal. "Head for the headquarters," Martinez ordered. "We need to find Calloway and Kovalchuk." As they drew closer to the center of town, they encountered more Germans, some still disoriented from the pulse, others already transformed like the first. These altered soldiers seemed to ignore their own comrades, focused instead on pursuing any unaffected personnel they encountered. "They're turning on their own people," Harrison observed, his earlier bloodlust now replaced by genuine horror. "They're not even people anymore," Martinez replied grimly. "Whatever that pulse did, it's changed them into something else." They were a block from the headquarters when they spotted Calloway stumbling from the building's rear entrance, supporting a barely conscious Kovalchuk. The lieutenant's face was streaked with blood from a gash across his forehead, and his left arm hung at an awkward angle. "Red!" Martinez called, rushing forward to help. Calloway's head snapped up, relief flooding his haggard features. "LT," he gasped. "Thank God. We need to move. Now." "What happened in there?" Harrison demanded, taking Kovalchuk's weight from Calloway. "Reinhardt," Calloway replied, his voice tight with pain. "He absorbed the pulse somehow, redirected it. Whatever we triggered, it wasn't what Kovalchuk expected." A terrible scream from inside the building punctuated his words. Moments later, a German soldier burst through a window, his uniform on fire, not with normal flames, but with flickering blue energy that seemed to consume him from within. He staggered a few steps before collapsing, still burning with that unnatural fire. "We need to get out of this town," Martinez said, already moving toward the eastern edge. "Back to the forest. Find Kleinman and the wounded." "If they're still alive," Harrison muttered. They made it 3 blocks before encountering another group of transformed Germans, 5 of them, moving with that same uncoordinated yet relentless gait, their glowing eyes fixed on the Americans with predatory focus. "Other way," Calloway ordered, pulling them down a narrow alley. But that route, too, was soon blocked by more of the altered soldiers emerging from doorways and side streets. "They're everywhere," Harrison hissed. "It's like they're hunting us specifically." "They are," Kovalchuk spoke for the first time, his voice weak but urgent. "Field effect creates attraction. They sense our neural activity. Unaltered minds draw them like beacon." "You're saying they can detect normal brain activity?" Martinez asked incredulously. "Yes, is how weapon was designed to work." Calloway's head snapped toward the engineer. "What do you mean at how it was designed to work? You told us it was an EMP device." Kovalchuk's face contorted with shame and regret. "Was lie, partial truth only. Electromagnetic disruption was initial phase. Secondary purpose was behavioral modification." "Behavioral modification?" Harrison echoed, disbelief etched on his face. "You mean mind control?" "Not control, disruption. Breaking enemies' will to fight, making them vulnerable to suggestion." Kovalchuk winced as a wave of pain passed through him. "But field has become unstable, effects unpredictable. Instead of making subjects passive, it has stripped away humanity. Left only base instincts, aggression, predatory drive. So these aren't Germans anymore, Martinez realized with growing horror. They're just hunting machines wearing human bodies. And Reinhardt? Calloway pressed. What about him? Different reaction. He absorbed field energy, metabolized it somehow, became conduit, amplifier. He is something new, something weapon creators never predicted. A chilling scream from nearby reminded them of their immediate peril. They were trapped in the heart of Diekirch, surrounded by transformed Germans with no clear path to escape. The church, Martinez suggested, pointing to a stone steeple visible above the surrounding buildings. Defensible position, good visibility. We can regroup, figure out our next move. With no better options, they made their way through back alleys and gardens, avoiding the main streets where the altered soldiers congregated in growing numbers. Twice they were spotted and pursued, forced to double back and find another route. But eventually they reached the small stone church on the village square. The heavy wooden doors creaked as Martinez and Harrison forced them open, then swung, shut with a satisfying thud once they were all inside. Calloway helped Kovalchuk to a pew, while Martinez and Harrison secured the entrances, wedging furniture against the doors and checking the windows for potential breaches. How many bullets do we have left? Calloway asked. Harrison counted his remaining ammunition. 17 rounds for me. Martinez? 23, the sergeant replied, plus whatever's in your sidearm, Red. 8, Calloway confirmed grimly. Not enough if they decide to rush us. Bullets don't seem to stop them anyway, Harrison pointed out. That first one I shot, he just kept coming. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group as they contemplated their situation. They were trapped in a hostile village, surrounded by entities that bullets couldn't kill, with limited ammunition and a wounded man. We never should have used it again, Martinez finally said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. We should have retreated when we had the chance. There was no other way, Calloway replied, though his tone lacked conviction. There's always another way, Martinez snapped. But you chose the easiest one, the most destructive one, and now we're trapped in a nightmare we don't understand, facing enemies we can't kill. Enough, Harrison interjected. Arguing won't get us out of here. We need a plan. Before anyone could respond, a low moan from Kovalchuk drew their attention. The engineer was hunched forward on the pew, his hands pressed to his temples. Victor? Calloway moved to his side. What is it? He's coming, Kovalchuk whispered, his voice trembling. Reinhardt, I can feel him, like pressure in my mind. He knows we're here. As if in response to his words, a strange hush fell over the village outside. The distant screams and sounds of chaos that had filled the night suddenly ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. What's happening? Harrison asked, peering through a narrow window. Look. Martinez pointed to the square outside. The altered Germans, they're clearing the area. It was true. The transformed soldiers who had been wandering aimlessly or hunting in packs were now moving with purpose, forming a perimeter around the church. But they weren't approaching. Instead, they seemed to be waiting, their glowing eyes fixed on the building with patient malice. They're not attacking, Calloway observed. Why? Because he wants us alive, Kovalchuk replied, his voice barely audible. Reinhardt, he wants connection, to understand what he has become. A new sound reached them then, measured footsteps crossing the cobblestone square. Through the window they could see a lone figure approaching the church. Hauptmann Otto. Reinhardt moved with fluid grace, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos that had engulfed his command. His eyes blazed with blue fire, casting long shadows before him. He's alone, Harrison noted, raising his rifle. I can take the shot. No! Kovalchuk's cry was unexpectedly forceful. Bullets will not harm him, will only provoke. The front doors of the church shuddered as someone struck them from outside. Not a battering ram or concerted effort to break in, but a single powerful blow that splintered the thick wood. Amerikaner? Reinhardt's voice carried easily through the damaged doors. I know you are inside. I can sense your minds, your fear, your confusion. Another blow and the doors cracked further. The furniture barricading the entrance shifted ominously. What do we do? Martinez asked, looking to Calloway. For once, the lieutenant seemed at a loss. The confident commander who had led them through artillery barrages in enemy territory now looked just as scared and uncertain as the rest of them. I want to speak with the scientist, Reinhardt called, the one who understands what has happened to me. Bring him outside, and the rest of you may live. Kovalchuk trembled visibly, shrinking back in his pew. Do not listen, he whispered. He lies. Once I am gone, he will kill you all. We're not handing you over, Calloway assured him, though his voice wavered slightly. No one gets left behind. A third blow to the doors, more powerful than the previous two. The wood splintered further, and the barricade began to give way. There must be another exit, Harrison said urgently. A back door, a sacristy, something. Martinez nodded, already moving toward the altar. There's usually a priest's entrance. Check behind the altar. As Harrison and Martinez searched for an alternate escape route, Calloway remained with Kovalchuk, his mind racing through their dwindling options. Victor, he said quietly, what is Reinhardt now? What has he become? The engineer's haunted eyes met his. Weapon was designed with two phases. First, electromagnetic disruption to disable technology. Second, neural manipulation to incapacitate enemy soldiers, make them susceptible to influence. But it went wrong, Calloway prompted. Yes, terribly wrong. Most subjects experienced neural breakdown, loss of higher functions, regression to primitive state like those outside. Kovalchuk gestured weakly toward the transformed Germans surrounding the church. But Reinhardt, his brain somehow adapted, integrated field effects instead of being overwhelmed by them. What does that mean in practical terms? It means he has gained abilities, can sense other minds, influence weaker ones, perhaps more we have not yet seen. A fourth blow to the doors sent the barricade crashing down. Only the bent and twisted hinges now prevented Reinhardt from entering. Found it, Martinez called from behind the altar. Service entrance, it leads to an alley behind the church. Go, Calloway ordered, helping Kovalchuk to his feet. Martinez, lead the way. Harrison, cover our rear. They moved quickly through the narrow passage Martinez had discovered, emerging into a dark alley behind the church just as the main doors finally gave way. From inside came the measured sound of Reinhardt's footsteps entering the sanctuary. Which way? Harrison hissed. Martinez pointed east. Forest is that direction. If we can reach the tree line, we might lose them. They had taken only a few steps when a German voice called from the darkness ahead. Halt! A group of unaltered German soldiers, a regular patrol apparently unaffected by the pulse, stood blocking the alley's exit, their rifles trained on the Americans. Surrender now, the sergeant in charge ordered in heavily accented English. For a brief moment, Calloway considered it. Regular Germans might be preferable to what lurked inside the church, but before he could respond, a terrible scream erupted from one of the German soldiers. The man clutched his head, his face contorted in agony as blue light began to glow behind his eyes. One by one, the patrol succumbed to the same fate, dropping their weapons as they convulsed in pain. Behind the Americans, Reinhardt emerged from the church, his hand extended toward the German patrol, fingers splayed as if physically grasping their minds. You see, Amerikaner? He said calmly, switching to perfect English. This is what your weapon has given me, the power to remake others in my image. The patrol sergeant was the last to transform, fighting the change longer than his men. But eventually he too straightened, his eyes now glowing with that eerie blue light, his expression vacant, yet somehow predatory. My God, Harrison whispered. He's converting them, just by willing it. He's using the residual field energy, Kovalchuk explained, his voice shaking. Channeling it through his own neural pathways, focusing it like lens. Reinhardt smiled, a terrifyingly normal expression on his inhuman face. The scientist understands. You have given me a gift beyond price, Amerikaner, the next stage of human evolution. He took a step toward them, and the newly transformed German patrol moved, in unison, blocking any escape route. I have questions, Reinhardt continued conversationally, about what I am becoming, about the limits of this power. The scientist will help me understand. We'll die first, Calloway declared, raising his pistol. Reinhardt's smile widened. That is not one of your options. With a casual gesture from the German officer, the transformed patrol surged forward. Harrison opened fire, dropping 2 of them with headshots, but the others kept coming. Martinez grabbed Kovalchuk, dragging him toward a narrow gap between buildings, their last possible escape route. Go, Calloway shouted, emptying his pistol into the advancing Germans. Get Kovalchuk out of here. Martinez hesitated, torn between duty and loyalty, but Harrison made the decision for him, physically shoving him and Kovalchuk toward the gap. Move, damn it, Harrison barked. We'll hold them off. As Martinez reluctantly pulled Kovalchuk into the narrow passage, Calloway and Harrison stood their ground, firing their last rounds at the approaching transformed patrol. But bullets that would have dropped normal men only slowed these abominations briefly. The last thing Martinez saw before the walls cut off his view was Calloway and Harrison being surrounded, fighting with empty weapons as clubs until they disappeared beneath a wave of grasping hands. Lieutenant, he called, nearly turning back. But Kovalchuk's urgent tugging on his arm reminded him of his responsibility. Cannot help them now, the engineer insisted. Must get away, warn others. With a last anguished look back, Martinez continued through the narrow passage, half carrying Kovalchuk as they fled into the darkness, the sounds of Reinhardt's unnatural army echoing behind them. Martinez half dragged Kovalchuk through the forest, every shadow seeming to reach for them with grasping blue fingers. Behind them, Diekirch had become a hellscape of unnatural light and inhuman screams. The sounds pursued them like physical entities, the death cries of men and the birth cries of something else entirely. We need to stop, Kovalchuk gasped, his legs buckling. Cannot go further. Martinez wanted to push on, to put as much distance as possible between them and the nightmare they'd unleashed, but the engineer was at his limit. Reluctantly, he helped Kovalchuk down beside a fallen tree, scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. 5 minutes, he said firmly. Then we move again. As Kovalchuk struggled to catch his breath, Martinez tried to process what they'd witnessed. Calloway and Harrison were gone, sacrificed to buy their escape. The weapon they'd been sent to deliver had turned out to be something far more sinister than they'd been told. And what of Kleinman and the wounded men? Had they made it to safety, or had they fallen victim to the spreading horror? Martinez! Kovalchuk's voice was barely above a whisper. There is something you must know. The sergeant turned, eyeing the engineer warily. More secrets, Victor? Haven't we had enough of those? This is different, is about field effect. Kovalchuk's face was ghostly in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. It spreads, grows, like living thing, and it follows. Pattern. What pattern? Neural pathways. Strongest minds attract it, become conduits, like Reinhardt, but then effect spreads outward, changing everything it touches. Martinez felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. Are you saying this thing will keep spreading? Beyond Diekirch? Beyond the Ardennes? Theoretically, yes, unless source is neutralized. Source? I thought the device was destroyed. Kovalchuk shook his head weakly. Device was trigger only. Real source is Reinhardt now. He has become Nexus, living generator of field effect. A distant, inhuman howl cut through the night, followed by another and another. Transformed soldiers hunting in packs, their prey unknown but their hunger insatiable. We need to move, Martinez decided, pulling Kovalchuk to his feet. Head. East. Find Kleinman and the others if they made it, then figure out how to deal with Reinhardt. They had covered less than half a mile when the sound of labored breathing and shuffling footsteps ahead stopped them in their tracks. Martinez raised his rifle, finger tightening on the trigger. But what emerged from the shadows wasn't a transformed German or one of Reinhardt's hunting packs. It was Kleinman, his uniform dark with blood, his young face ashen but determined. "Sergeant," he called weakly, swaying on his feet. "Kleinman." Martinez rushed forward, catching the private as he collapsed. "Jesus, kid, what happened to you?" "Sniper," Kleinman managed, wincing as Martinez examined the wound in his side. "Got the bastard, but his buddy got me. Sent the others ahead. Followed when I could." "You're lucky to be alive," Martinez observed grimly. The wound was serious, a through and through that had torn muscle but missed vital organs. Still, blood loss and shock were imminent threats. "Others made it?" Kovalchuk asked, kneeling beside them. "Think so," Kleinman replied. Dawson was leading them east toward the stream like the lieutenant ordered. His eyes searched the darkness behind them. "Where's the lieutenant and Harrison?" Martinez's expression told him everything he needed to know. "Oh," Kleinman said softly. Then after a moment, Did it cost something? Were their deaths worth it?" It was the kind of direct, innocent question only someone as young as Kleinman could ask. Martinez had no answer that wouldn't sound hollow or cruel. "We need to keep moving," he said instead. "Can you walk?" "If you help me," Kleinman nodded. With Kovalchuk on one side and Martinez on the other, they supported Kleinman as they continued eastward. Their progress was painfully slow, each step a negotiation between urgency and the limitations of their injured comrade. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit ebbed and flowed, sometimes seeming to recede, other times closing in with terrifying proximity. They had been moving for perhaps an hour when a flare illuminated the sky to the north. Not the chaotic blue energy of the weapons effects, but the familiar red glow of a standard military signal flare. "Could be the others," Kleinman suggested, hopefully. "Or it could be Germans," Martinez countered. "Remember, not all of them have been affected by the pulse." "Either way is closest sign of human activity," Kovalchuk pointed out, "and Kleinman needs medical attention soon." Martinez weighed their options. Continuing east meant a longer journey with an increasingly weakened Kleinman. Heading north toward the flare meant potential rescue, but also potential danger. In the ice tier, and necessity made the decision for him. "We'll check it out," he decided, "but carefully. At first sign of trouble, we fade back into the forest." They altered course, moving north through increasingly dense undergrowth. As they drew closer to where the flare had been launched, Martinez detected a familiar scent. Diesel fuel and cigarette smoke. Military vehicles. But whose? "Stay here," he instructed, lowering Kleinman gently to the ground. "I'll scout ahead." Moving silently through the darkness, Martinez approached what appeared to be a small clearing. The smell of diesel grew stronger, along with voices, muffled conversations punctuated by occasional coughs or the striking of matches. As he crept closer, relief flooded through him. The voices were speaking English. Americans. A forward reconnaissance. Team by the look of it. 2 jeeps and a small contingent of men, perhaps a dozen in total. Among them, Martinez recognized Corporal Dawson, which meant the wounded men from Kleinman's group had indeed made it to safety. He was about to step forward and announce himself when something made him hesitate. There was something off about the scene, a tension in the way the men were standing, a nervous energy that suggested more than just the usual battlefield wariness. And then he saw it. One of the soldiers near the edge of the group had turned slightly, his face illuminated by the glow of a cigarette. His eyes reflected the light with an unnatural blue luminescence. Martinez felt his blood run cold. The weapon's effect had reached these men too, or at least some of them. But unlike the transformed Germans in Diekirch, these infected soldiers weren't rampaging or hunting. They were waiting, infiltrating, hiding their condition while mingling with their unaffected comrades. As he watched, the blue-eyed soldier casually moved to stand behind another man. his posture shifting subtly from human to predatory. Martinez realized with horror what was about to happen, but before he could call out a warning, the transformed soldier struck, seizing his victim from behind with inhuman strength, one hand clamping over the man's mouth while the other pressed against his temple. Blue energy crackled between them for a brief, terrible moment, and then it was over. The victim's struggles ceased, and when he turned, his eyes too glowed with that same eerie light. The infection was spreading, and it was doing so silently, strategically, one soldier at a time. Martinez backed away carefully. He had to warn Kleinman and Kovalchuk. They couldn't approach the American position. Not now. Not with the weapons' effect already taking hold there. But as he turned to retreat, his foot snapped a fallen branch with a sound that seemed to echo through the silent forest. Instantly, every head in the clearing turned in his direction, every glowing blue eye fixed on his position with predatory focus. "Sergeant Martinez," Dawson called out, his face friendly but his eyes blazing with that unnatural light. "We've been waiting for you. Come join us. The transformation, it's not what we thought. It's better, clearer." Martinez ran, crashing through the undergrowth with no attempt at stealth. Behind him he heard the shouts of pursuit, not just confused inquiries but coordinated hunting calls, directing the pack toward their prey. He reached Kleinman and Kovalchuk in a matter of minutes, gasping for breath. Americans, infected, spreading. He managed between ragged breaths. "How many?" Kleinman asked, already struggling to his feet despite his wound. "Too many," Martinez replied grimly. "And they're organized, not like the mindless ones in Diakirch. These are hunting intelligently, using strategy." "Is evolution a field effect?" Kovalchuk explained, his voice tight with fear. "First wave, primitive transformation. Second wave, more sophisticated, maintaining higher functions while altering loyalty, purpose." "Loyalty to what?" Kleinman asked. "To Reinhardt," Kovalchuk replied. "Or rather, to what Reinhardt represents now. The nexus. The source." "We need to move," Martinez urged. "Now." "Wait," Kleinman said, his young face set with determination that seemed at odds with his wounded state. "I know where we can go. There's an old bunker about a mile east of here, part of the Siegfried Line, abandoned when the Germans pushed forward. Dawson and I found it while scouting earlier. It's defensible, might buy us some time." Martinez nodded. "Lead the way." They moved as quickly as Kleinman's wound would allow, the sounds of pursuit ebbing and flowing behind them. Twice they had to change direction to avoid search parties, and once they lay motionless in a shallow depression as transformed American soldiers passed within yards of their position, their glowing eyes scanning the darkness with unnatural acuity. The bunker, when they finally reached it, was little more than a concrete box half buried in the side of a small hill. Its steel door hung askew on rusted hinges, but its walls were thick, and it offered a defensible position with only one entrance. Once inside, Martinez helped Kleinman sit against a wall while Kovalchuk examined the interior. The bunker had been stripped of most equipment, but a rusted first aid kit still hung on one wall, and debris scattered around the floor could be used to barricade the entrance. "How are you holding up, kid?" Martinez asked, checking Kleinman's wound. The bandage was soaked through with blood and the private skin was clammy and pale, signs of advancing shock. "I've been better, Sergeant." Kleinman managed a weak smile. "But I'll make it." Kovalchuk had been staring at the far wall of the bunker, his expression distant. Now he turned to Martinez, his face resolute for the first time since they'd fled. "Diekirch." "I know how to stop this," he said quietly. "Stop what? The pursuit?" "All of it. The field effect. The spread. Reinhardt." The engineer's voice grew stronger with each word. "But will require sacrifice." Martinez eyed him suspiciously. "What kind of sacrifice?" "The field energy responds to neural activity, is drawn to it, feeds on it. But if sufficiently powerful counter-resonance is created, like feedback loop in audio system, the effect could be neutralized, collapsed back on itself. And how exactly do we create this counter-resonance?" Kovalchuk's gaze was steady. With my brain. I helped design this weapon. My neural pathways are attuned to its frequency, you might say. If I can get close enough to Reinhardt, I can trigger cascade failure in the field. Close enough? Martinez scoffed. You mean let him capture you? That's suicide, Victor. It is only way. Field will continue to spread otherwise, eventually will consume everything. Everyone. A sudden noise from outside. A twig snapping, a muffled voice reminded them of their immediate danger. Martinez moved to the entrance, peering cautiously into the darkness. What he saw made his blood run cold. Approaching the bunker was a group of transformed soldiers, both American and German, moving together with eerie coordination. At their center walked Reinhardt himself, his eyes blazing with blue fire, his face serene despite the chaos he embodied. And beside him, battered but alive, was Lieutenant Calloway. My God, Kleinman whispered, peering over Martinez's shoulder. The lieutenant, they've got him. But something wasn't right. Calloway wasn't bound or being dragged. He walked under, his own power, face impassive, eyes normal, not glowing like the transformed, but alert and aware. He made deal, Kovalchuk realized aloud. Reinhardt spared him, using him as bait perhaps, or envoy. As if confirming this assessment, Calloway stepped forward from the group, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. Martinez, he called. I know you're in there. I need to talk to you. Martinez hesitated, then called back. What happened to Harrison? A flicker of emotion crossed Calloway's face. Regret, perhaps, or guilt. He didn't make it, but his sacrifice bought us an opportunity. Reinhardt wants to negotiate. Negotiate? Martinez couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. With what? For what? For the future, Sergeant. Calloway's voice had taken on an unsettling quality. Not quite his own, but not entirely alien, either. What's happening here? It's not what we thought. It's evolution, the next step, and we can be part of it. Martinez turned to Kovalchuk, whose face had gone deathly pale. He's been compromised, the engineer whispered. Not fully transformed, but influenced. Reinhardt is using him as conduit to reach us. Lieutenant, Kleinman called weakly, his young voice cracking with emotion. This isn't you talking. Fight it. Remember who you are. A flicker of doubt crossed Calloway's face, a momentary crack in the facade Reinhardt had constructed. For a brief instant, the real Calloway seemed to surface, his eyes clearing. Martinez, he gasped, his voice suddenly his own again. Don't listen. It's in my head. Controlling. Can't fight it for long. You need to end this. End me if you have to, but don't let this spread. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the moment of clarity passed, and Calloway's expression smoothed back into that eerie calm. Last chance, Sergeant. Join us willingly or join us anyway. Those are the only options now. Martinez looked to Kovalchuk. Your plan. The counter-resonance. Will it work? The engineer nodded grimly. If I can get close enough to Reinhardt, but will be one-way mission. For me. Not just you, Kleinman spoke up, his voice stronger than seemed possible given his condition. I'll do it. Kid, you can barely stand, Martinez protested. Exactly, Kleinman replied. I'm already bleeding out, Sergeant. We all know it, but I can still move, still think. And if Kovalchuk can tell me what to do, I can get close enough to Reinhardt. Martinez wanted to argue, but the pragmatic soldier in him recognized the cold calculation in Kleinman's offer. The private was dying already. If his death could mean something could save others, wasn't that the best a soldier could hope for? Kovalchuk knelt beside him, speaking rapidly in low tones. Martinez couldn't make out the words, but he saw Kleinman nodding, his young face set with determination despite the pain that clearly racked him. Martinez, Calloway's voice called again. We're coming in. Last chance to join willingly. The bunker's entrance burst open. Transformed soldiers poured in, their glowing eyes fixing immediately on the three Americans. Behind them came Calloway, and then, ducking to enter the low doorway, Reinhardt himself. The German officer's presence filled the small space like a physical force. Blue energy crackled around him and his eyes blazed with inhuman intelligence. When he spoke, his voice was resonant with power. "The scientist," he said, looking directly at Kovalchuk. "And the dying boy." His gaze shifted to Kleinman. "How touching. A last stand in this pitiful hole." "It's over, Reinhardt," Martinez said, raising his rifle. "Whatever you've become, whatever you think you're creating, it ends here." Reinhardt smiled. "No, Sergeant. It is just beginning." He raised his hand, and blue energy coalesced around his fingertips. Martinez felt a pressure in his mind, like fingers probing, searching for a way in. He fought it, but the pressure increased, bringing with it a pain that threatened to overwhelm his senses. "Now, Victor!" Kleinman suddenly shouted, lunging forward with a strength born of desperation. He crashed into Reinhardt, arms wrapping around the German officer in what looked like a suicidal embrace. Kovalchuk began speaking rapidly in Russian. Not words, but a sequence of numbers and letters. A code of some kind. As he spoke, Kleinman's body began to glow with the same blue energy that surrounded Reinhardt. But there was something different about it. A dissonance, a chaos in the pattern. Reinhardt's confidence faltered for the first time. He struggled to break free from Kleinman's grasp, but the dying private held on with the strength of the damned. "Run!" Kovalchuk shouted to Martinez, still reciting his mathematical incantation. "Now!" Martinez fled, bursting past the transformed soldiers who seemed suddenly disoriented, their coordination failing as the link to their master was disrupted. He was 50 yards from the bunker when the world exploded behind him, not with fire and shrapnel, but with a concussive wave of energy that rippled through the forest like a tsunami. Trees bent, their branches swaying as if in a gale. The ground itself seemed to shudder. Martinez was thrown forward, skidding across the forest floor as the wave passed over and through him. For a terrifying moment, he felt the same cold fire that had accompanied the original pulse, that sense of something alien passing through his very cells. Then it was gone, leaving him gasping on the ground as silence descended once more upon the Ardennes. When he could move again, Martinez looked back toward the bunker. Where the concrete structure had stood was now a perfectly circular clearing, not burned or blasted, but simply empty, as if that section of the world had been erased from existence. And all around him, the transformed soldiers had collapsed, like puppets with their strings cut. Some lay motionless, truly dead at last. Others twitched and moaned, their eyes now normal, their expressions confused and pained as they struggled to comprehend what had happened to them. Among them was Calloway, sprawled on his back, staring up at the stars with eyes that were his own again. As Martinez approached cautiously, the lieutenant turned his head. "LT?" Martinez knelt beside him. "You with me?" Calloway's laugh was bitter, edged with pain. "I'm here. Whatever was in my head, it's gone. But I remember everything." Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. "God help me, Martinez, I remember it all." Martinez helped his commander to sit up, scanning the area for any sign of danger. But the forest was quiet now, the unnatural energy dissipated. Whatever Kleinman and Kovalchuk had done, it had worked. The field effect was gone. "Kleinman?" Calloway asked, already knowing the answer. Martinez shook his head. "Him and Kovalchuk both. They sacrificed themselves. Created some kind of counter-resonance, Kovalchuk called it. Collapsed the field back on itself." "And Reinhardt?" "Gone too. All of it. Gone." As the first pale light of dawn broke over the eastern horizon, they began the grim work of sorting the living from the dead. A new day was beginning. A day in which the world remained unaware of how close it had come to an evolutionary shift that would have left humanity unrecognizable. Some weapons should never be used. Some lines should never be crossed. Some powers were never meant for human hands. These were the lessons written in the blood of good men like Kleinman, in the sacrifice of the guilt-ridden Kovalchuk, and in the haunted eyes of survivors like Calloway and Martinez. Lessons that would never appear in any official report, but which they would carry with them for the rest of their days, as would the world, whether it knew it or not. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.